Okay, so let's do a countdown, and we'll introduce the guests once again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Welcome everyone to the Juicecast episode 7. Today, with me, I have Philip, ST, and the Hylian. The Hylian and Philip are both new guests on the podcast, and it's awesome to see them here. If you're new here, what this podcast is all about is it's about us bringing our subjective experiences and opinions on the game and having a discussion about it, along with going into some analysis on the gameplay, the story, the artwork and music, etc., etc. So if this is your first one and you want to check out the other podcasts that we've done on some Sonic games, then you can check those out in the description below. Also, all guest links will also be in the description, so feel free to check them out later. Philip, why don't you introduce yourself?
All right, what's up, guys? My name is Philip. I'm an actor and a filmmaker. I love Final Fantasy. You may have seen my Shaolin Temple documentary, where I lived as a warrior monk in China. I also cosplay with my girlfriend, and we're known for doing the male Tifa and female Barret. That was a lot of fun, and just love Final Fantasy. And I teach filmmaking through Final Fantasy on my gaming channel.
Yeah, it's funny, like, when I first found you, it was through your YouTube on, like, Filmmaker reacts to Final Fantasy VII Remake trailer or something like that. It was a long, long time ago.
That's a bit ago, yeah.
Yeah,
That's awesome, man.
And I saw that, and that was awesome. And then I saw your male Tifa cosplay as well on Twitter, and it's funny, we've both done that now.
Amazing, yeah. Thank you. It's so cool, man.
That's great.
Too much fun.
And how about you, ST?
Yeah, hi, it is me, ST. I primarily, big Zelda fan, as you can probably tell. I'm planning on doing Zelda analysis once college wraps up later this year for me, so that'll be fun to get started. Beyond that, my experience with Final Fantasy is pretty limited in general. I haven't played many of the games, only played a couple, but so far they've all been positive experiences. And I didn't get a ton of time with this game, unfortunately, due to college stuff, but I have positive things to say.
Awesome. And how about you, Hylian?
Well, greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm the Hylian. I'm glad to be here, Juice. I have my own YouTube channel right now. I work with art analysis in general, so I break down relevant artworks throughout history, ones that have landed an impact, both positive and negatively, to each craft. And I contribute to both with both my own subjective experiences, as well as breaking down each part of the games and films normatively. And currently I'm working on the original Final Fantasy VII. I'm working on a series called A Living Legacy. I don't know if many of you have heard of it or not. If so, please do check out. I'm a huge Final Fantasy fan, and I'm looking forward to this discussion a lot and meeting a lot of you as well in the comments and everyone here as well. This is the first time I'm actually in a podcast with all three of you, actually. I've never actually shared the stage with any of you, so this is going to be an honor. And so have fun, I guess.
Yeah, a fun one indeed it will be. And for those of you who are coming from Philip, ST, or Hylian's communities, I am Juice. I'm a variety streamer over on Twitch. I also do game and character analysis on my YouTube channel, which I'm currently backlogging a lot of content so that I can release it steadily, so look forward to that. It's going to be hard to pull from characters for Final Fantasy 1, though. I think I'm going to have to look into some other content for something like Warrior of Light, because there's not too much there as far as character. But it should be fun regardless.
But what about Totally Vivi? That's what I do.
Oh, Black Mage? Yeah.
Yeah, that's totally Vivi.
But my Final Fantasy background comes from playing Final Fantasy 9, Final Fantasy 7 Remake, and then just like learning about the series from multiple people in the community. So I'm big in there, and I'm looking forward to meeting anyone who's new here. So without any further ado, I guess we can get started talking about the game. So let's see what I have started here. For one, we can go into our personal history with Final Fantasy 1. So whoever wants to start on that can go ahead. Like when you first played it.
Mine's very brief. Final Fantasy 1 was always a game I was curious about, but I never had an easy opportunity to really play the original game, and I still don't, at least not legally. I tried getting it on, like, say, like the Wii console, but just I was having difficulty with that. So I ended up having to get the one on Steam, and I don't have much personal history with it, which is why I wanted to go first, because I don't really have a ton of history to share beyond just, I know it exists, and it's the one that started it all. It's pretty much all I have for it.
Cool. How about you, Philip?
For Final Fantasy 1, it's my first video game ever. And
okay.
I had a lot of fun times with it, even though it was like far beyond my skill level as a toddler when I was playing it. It was a really imagination sort of driving experience for me, kind of because it's a very rare type of gaming experience back then. Kind of like name your characters, make a party, and everything. And I'm sure we'll get more into this later, but it's just such a beautiful experience as a kid because because of the lighter story, you are able to kind of insert a lot of imaginative stories and everything in your head. Like when you think about Garland or these characters who are just kind of almost open slates, and you can kind of imagine their backstories and everything until Stranger of Paradise. But it's just it's just fun to it was a great experience for me. And my personal history is my first game. Later in life, I couldn't have like a Super Nintendo. So later in life, I got a PS2 and played Final Fantasy X. And that was my reintroduction to the series. And I was like, oh, this is our favorite game when we were kids, me and my brother. Then we went back and played like the other ones that were available, and just really fell even more in love with the series.
Amazing. It's very interesting to me, like, to hear that Final Fantasy 1 was your first gaming experience ever.
Yeah. Yeah, most people are like, oh, I wonder how this, like, they play the new ones. So yeah, for me, I was just like, oh, I love this. And then there's more. Like, so it was awesome.
How about you, Hylian?
Well, it wasn't my first Final Fantasy. I think it's relevant to point out, like, I started getting into Final Fantasy actually through the Super Nintendo. So I played Final Fantasy VI first. Then 7 came out, and it completely captured my heart as well. So after 6 and 7, I decided to look back at every single Final Fantasy I could get my hands on, including Final Fantasy 1. Unfortunately, I never, when I grew up, I didn't have access to the NES. So it was basically kind of working like an archaeologist, trying to get the older systems and getting to hang out with older gamers and hear their experiences, etc. So when I eventually got my hands on it, it was like around the early 2000s. It really was a wonderful experience to me. It's very much a very early day RPG. Like, there are a lot of tropes and tendencies from tabletop RPGs, and that's something that draw me to it in a different way that more modern Final Fantasy games did. So basically, ever since I played Final Fantasy 1, like, I didn't have many replay experiences, but I've always held Final Fantasy 1 in a special place for me, exactly because of how perhaps more than its characters, I think its world building is probably one of the most interesting things about it that has stuck to me for a very long time, and I see aspects of it popping out throughout the series. So I guess that could be my history for it. I think that should paint a good picture.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess for me, like, my experience with the series was, like, I did not grow up with Final Fantasy. Like, I heard about it from a few people, but none of my friends played it or anything like that. So it took, like, Cloud coming out in Smash to eventually get me to pick up Final Fantasy, and it was when 9 came out on Switch, because I was like, oh, I really want to play 7, but I'm going to wait till it comes out on Switch. But 9 came first, so I played 9 first and fell in love with that game. And it's really funny, like, playing 9 because of like its callbacks to Final Fantasy 1 in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
which you
Mhm.
know,
Yeah.
it had me thinking about it when I was playing this game. Like obviously, like the quest with the 4 fiends and everything like that, where
Mhm.
the game kind of like halts and then makes you do that in 9. Whereas this one, you know, it's kind of the whole thing. But yeah, so eventually I was like, okay, I do want to go back and play all of the classics. Like I have to. I want to know what I'm talking about. I want to experience all these games, all these stories, and really understand the history of the series. So here we are now, and I was like, which version should I play? And then the pixel remasters for all of them came out. So I was like, okay, let's go with that then. And I played it for the first time this month, you know, February. So yeah, I mean that's pretty much my personal history with it, and I guess like I won't spoil how I feel completely about the game yet until we go into all the topics, but it was definitely like an experience, and it was pretty much like what I was thinking it was going to be. You know what I mean? And it felt really good to finally play it. So, but yeah. Okay, so moving forward, I guess we can talk about the development history. What was the development like, and what inspired the game? Now, this one I'm not as versed on as maybe some other people here. All I know is, of course, that like it was Square's like last hope, right? Is to do their Final Fantasy, and that's the game that they had made. I know that it's inspired heavily from like tabletop RPGs, like you were saying, Hylian, and other things such as Dragon Quest, like of course. So,
Of course.
if anyone wants to take the wheel from me and go on with their knowledge, then feel free.
I'm in the same boat, so it's not going to be me.
Well, Philip, if since it's your first game, I can't see a more special game to you. So please be my guest to be the first one.
Yeah, I'll talk about it briefly. I mean, as far as we know, you know, Square Enix did, I think, was like a card game company and other sort of, you know, gaming type company before this. And then they had done a few like racing games and a bunch of very non-RPG content.
Did they make
before Final
Galaxian
Fantasy.
or something?
Yeah,
Was
stuff
that
like that.
them, or is that someone
And
else?
then-
I don't remember.
I think it was, yeah. And then they acquired Nobuo Uematsu, who's of course the musician for Final Fantasies 1 through 10 and beyond. And they acquired him before Final Fantasy. And then with FF, yeah, I think it's pretty much what you're saying. Sakaguchi said, like, you know, he's probably going to retire from making video games at this point. He's going to kind of do his like swan song Final Fantasy and really try to make a really, really special experience and a very sort of imaginative experience and give his all. And then, of course, you know, inspired by Dragon Quest and tabletop and D&D. And of course, we have Final Fantasy 1, which is a huge success. And then he doesn't stop because people really enjoyed it.
I was going to say that 8 more happened.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because he really made a great game. So beyond that, I don't know too much, you know, crazy details. If Hylian knows beyond that, I'd love to know more. But yeah.
Oh, I'm sure.
So I in the Living Legacy, I released the first part, and before I explore Final Fantasy VII, there is the introduction sequence where I explore the entire context of the series, and I did a lot of digging to find more details about it, and it's actually extremely interesting to look at the background because it really did influence future titles as well in terms of its storytelling and its world building. And
I agree for sure. Yeah.
So Squaresoft was initially just they were part of an electric power company called Denyu-sha, and Masafumi Miyamoto opened this part called Square, where they were informally working on video games and seeing if they could make a big bang on the market. And they've tried to first publish some games. I think the big one that inspired Sakaguchi to try and get into making an RPG was Dragon Slayer from Falcom. They actually published that, and from that experience and with Sakaguchi's immense love for Western RPGs, so responding to your question, so the main influences for Final Fantasy 1, it was Dungeons and Dragons, but that was mainly behind both Sakaguchi and the battle designer. So a lot of monsters, a lot of the design of dungeon crawling that the game has is directly imported from Dungeons and Dragons. But there is also Ultima and Wizardry, which were probably the biggest RPG titles before even Dragon Quest. There is even an interview where the battle designer mentioned about he talked to Sakaguchi before the game came out, and they were saying, man, like Dragon Quest proved to the presidency at Square that we could make an RPG, but Dragon Quest still didn't capture that magic of Western RPGs that we loved. So stuff like elemental properties to weapons. There are certain weaknesses that certain enemies have to different types of elements and weapons. So they wanted to really bring this into the gameplay. So Ultima and Wizardry were the big ones, and finally Star Wars. Star Wars is also a big influence for Sakaguchi and the storytelling. You can see this even from cinematic perspective with the title crawl. Like the employment of title crawls really started to explode after 1977 as a way to introduce the world building and the context of the story. So those were the big things that really you can really tell that there are big influences from those 4 or 5 major works of art, I should say.
Thank you for reminding me about things like Wizardry and other, Western RPGs on the computer that came before. And it's like, it's not stuff that I didn't know, but it's stuff that was like, please, Hylian, take the wheel. You know this stuff off the top of your head. I know it for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the historical context. That was great.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I think this Western RPG heritage is probably one of the big reasons why Final Fantasy actually landed so well with Western audiences, much like a long time before Dragon Quest had the opportunity to. So that's one of the reasons why Enix merged with Square, because they looked at Final Fantasy as a franchise that had a major presence in the West, and they wanted to get that Western presence that Dragon Quest didn't have yet. So, and that a lot of that comes from the Western heritage that Final Fantasy 1 got. So that's a very important background to keep in mind.
Very cool. Definitely important. Okay, cool. So now that we know kind of what happened during the development, and we also have to think that like the development was usually like typically not done with like a big team or anything like that until like Square kind of changed that as well, where they had definitely I don't know exactly the size of the team on Final Fantasy, but they definitely did have like story writers, artists, and everyone kind of working in tandem with each other, where before that it was kind of just like a programmer who did most of the game themselves. So that's also something that goes into
Apparently it was less than 10 people working on Final Fantasy 1. Like that's crazy to think about. Like was just one battle director, one guy behind the music, one guy behind the one person. She was Kazuko Shibuya. She is the main designer behind the pixels, the pixel art, and it was a very, very small team.
Yeah. Akin to what you would see from like indie developers today, if that, sometimes less.
Yeah.
But, so it's very interesting how the industry has shifted over the course of time, just because of the requirements that you need now for modern AAA games, of course.
Yeah.
Technology.
Yeah.
And when you look at FF7, which is like viewed by a lot of people as the first AAA game ever, like they're into the triple digits for people working on that game and stuff. And it's crazy that just for FF7, like they're already there. And then now it's such massive art undertaking, which is just so cool.
25 years later, here we are. So moving past the development history, I wrote down reception and reviews. How is the game received on release, and how is it perceived by the fan base and general public nowadays? So when this game released, it was released to like mass appraise and appeal. Like it seems like it kind of blew up when it released, not only in the East but also in the West.
Makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when I compare it to now, it's hard because I hear half the fan base saying like you don't really need to go back and play it and stuff like that, and then the other half's like you definitely should just to see like the history of the Final Fantasy franchise and stuff like that. But it's interesting. Like, is it worth going back to, or is it not? I would say that it is, but
I don't think you need to. I would never tell someone they need to because it's a
Yeah.
big ask for anyone to play like a retro game like that. But what I always say is like, you really, if you're a huge fan of the series, like you'd be surprised, especially Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 3, how much of the later stuff comes from these games. Like even FF2, but I think a little bit less. How much of the iconography, like all the summons and the job system and just all these cool callbacks, you know, Chocobo's, Sid, and all that stuff. It's really a fun experience if you're that into all that, you know, the later lore and stuff. But beyond that, I mean, the music's great and it's great to see where it all came from. But I would never say someone needs to,
yeah,
personally. Like us, you know, fanatics.
right.
Yeah.
And as far as like, I'm pretty sure it was reviewed like very highly when it came out, but now I don't know. I haven't really kept up with. I mean, not that it like really matters. It like reviewers and stuff like that on Final Fantasy 1 now. I don't think. I think there's like a clear difference in like what matters more.
The validity of that, yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
When it was the height of technology versus
yeah,
now,
exactly. Like you can't really compare the two things. It's
Mhm.
interesting to think about both sides of it, but like
Yeah.
you know, for
Well, yeah,
just
I was
for-
talking to somebody the other day about like somebody asked me like, what's a better game, Final Fantasy 6 or Final Fantasy 7 remake? And I'm like, they're not even the
What?
same. They're pretty much not even the same medium. Like they cannot be compared. It's
Yeah.
almost saying like, what's better, like a book or like, you know, watching.
movie.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. It's just too different. Like you're looking
Mhm.
at like there's performances now. There's actors. There's no performance in Final Fantasy 6. It's just like reading a novel sort of. So yeah, it's too different. You can't compare FF1 to like a modern, you know,
Right,
gaming experience even
exactly.
further back. Yeah.
and I feel like that's like a lot of the context that might be missing in like modern reviews of the game and stuff like that too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure. They'll
yeah,
just be like,
yeah.
it's not as fun as like the combat in FF7 remake. Like,
Yeah.
Like,
I was
probably
gonna,
not,
yeah. What do you expect? Yeah.
I was gonna say actually, like, one of the core things about my analysis process that I take in my channel, and I think it's important for critics in general, is like take into account the context of release of the work, because art can only be fully appreciated if you understand the limitations that the artist had, because something might look archaic today, but if you look at like the tools that they had in hand and how much they achieved with those limited tools, you realize like, wow, they needed a lot of talent to pull off something like this back then, you know. It's we take a lot of things for granted when we grow up with a particular set of tools that we have in hand. Like today we have like 3D games everywhere, like high definition graphics, and everybody is like, wow, these visuals are amazing, etc. And there are a lot of people who really struggle today to go back to 2D games, to very early games. Like today we have this philosophy, this game design philosophy, where challenges are kind of harder to be accepted, like open-ended exploration and cryptic clues, etc., being scattered around the world isn't as well accepted today as it was back then. So even in terms of like what was the audience back then, like who were playing games back then, like they were different. So when you're judging like how well a work of art performed, like you need to look at the time of the version that you're looking into. So when I look at Final Fantasy 1 and compare it to today, I agree with you, Juice. From what I've heard from people who grew up at the time, and I think that Philip will 100% agree with me on this. Like it really was a very impactful game, even with the bugs that the game had. Like, oh, Firestar doesn't have like effective damage against ice enemies because of programming issues. Like even with those issues at hand, people still loved the game back then, and it really impacted a lot of people, both in the West and the East. And when you talk to fans today, especially when you're talking to people who are like, okay, what was the golden age of Final Fantasy? Like, if you were to suggest people to play Final Fantasy, which ones would you play? A lot of the time, I see people suggest, oh, play 4 through 9 or 4 through 10.
Yeah.
And so I see people skipping 1 through 3, and like skipping 1 is kind of sad. A lot of people look at 1 as like, oh, it's just this game with a very simplistic story with no characters and a very hard dungeon crawling mechanics where magic is not really tied to MP, it's leveled up, etc. So it's harder to digest. So I see today kind of a bigger resistance to Final Fantasy 1 because of how much it was designed for its time, I think. And I see even Pixel Remaster, it of course brought a lot of quality of life changes, but there are still some remnants of the NES version that a lot of people who play a Pixel Remaster, they still look at Final Fantasy 1 and say, yeah, this is very basic, etc. Fourth onwards is probably the better part, etc. So I think it's interesting to bring this into attention because Final Fantasy 1 is one of those works where it really shows how important context is and how fan bases evolve over time. Like, so
yeah, and I think that's a very interesting thing to bring up. But at the same time, I can't blame someone for like not being able to get into something like Final Fantasy 1 as well. Like you said, it was like for the audience at the time, which I'm sure we'll get into later when we get into like exploration and gameplay and stuff like that. But there are a lot of like what I would consider inconveniences in Final Fantasy 1 playing it today. Well,
yeah, you couldn't play it. Like, unless you're a retro enthusiast, like really, like there's no maps. The original, in the Pixel Remaster, the maps and stuff, like you just wander around and you die.
Yeah, I am so happy that I had dungeon maps in the Pixel Remaster. But yeah, like I think it's like you can't separate the art from the time, but at the same time, I feel like it's important for like for the discussion for people who want to go into it for the first time that they should know exactly what they're going to be getting into, and that like like you can't really compare like modern games to a game like this. You just can't.
I mean, the whole experience. When me and my brother were playing it when we were like little kids and toddlers, essentially, we're like, it's just not even a comparative experience. Like not even art. Like we would see like on this black screen, there wasn't even backgrounds in FF1 OG. Like it was a little strip on the top that showed like a couple trees. You're like, oh, it's supposed to be a forest.
Yeah.
And the whole screen was just black, and your characters are on the side and stuff. And it's just imagination takes over, right? So like, you would be fighting, and it's like, oh, that's like an ogre or something. That's crazy. And me and my brother would be like trying to draw these people, these characters and stuff. Versus today, again, I say FF7 remake. Like there's an ogre on the screen. He's in a sewer or whatever. You can see it all. So it's just a totally different. Like,
and you guys mentioned maps as well. One of the big things that old games of that time had, like if you bought games, not only were manuals extremely important to tell stories, we're going to get into this as well because Final Fantasy 1 is kind of special in this regard, but when you bought RPGs, including Final Fantasy 1, you got usually a map where you could draw a lot of things. Like RPGs had a lot of this, where you have this, you usually have these papers where you are kind of the master of your own direction. So you draw stuff on the paper, exactly, oh, this is the map layout of this dungeon, and I'm going to go here because there is a chest here, here, and here. So I think because of how this, of the hardware limitations not providing easy access for maps, so and storytelling as well, so a lot of things had to come manually, physically as well for players, and we don't need that anymore. A lot of games today just provide a lot of this for us to indulge in. So when you play the NES version without the manual, without the maps, etc., and you aren't aware of the culture back then of, oh, you need to draw everything here, it was designed for this, then you're probably going to be a lot more lost and kind of like, wow, this game is kind of weird. So yeah, it's a very different culture, very different type of of how to approach playing a game like this as well.
Yeah, especially with today where a lot of games are just like digitally downloaded, where I guess you can include this kind of stuff in like menus and whatnot if it's not in the gameplay itself for that convenience. But otherwise, yeah, it would have to come in like the physical medium of the guidebooks and stuff like that. So it must have sucked to try to play Final Fantasy 1 without a guidebook, as you know, whoever grew up with it, I would hope they didn't have that experience.
One time my cousin gave us his like Nintendo and Final Fantasy because he was older, and our guidebook was like one time we saw him at a family dinner and we're like, hey, we have no idea what to do, and he like wrote on a napkin like, go to Marsh Cave, kill wizards, and we're like, we knew that, like how do we do that?
Yeah.
So it was like the Dark Souls of NES games, I'm telling you. It's just you die over and over again. I mean, plus as kids, like you don't know. You got to remember, now we know what RPGs are. Like we understand. It's like, you level your characters. You go get the best equipment in this current town. Then you move on to the next area. Then you can grind and stuff. We were kids. We didn't know that stuff. I was like 4 years old. I'm just like, I want to go see what happens in the story. So yeah, you take for granted like it was one of the first gaming RPGs. You know?
Yeah,
it wasn't like common knowledge. Yeah.
Okay, well, that being said, since we're already starting to get into the gameplay and exploration and stuff like that, why don't we just hop right into the job system and customization? How does that play into the individual's experience and replayability?
Oh, man, I can just say it's amazing.
Yeah,
like,
absolutely.
So much fun. So much fun. Like, we would just start new games all the time, probably because we died so much. Yeah, we would just start new games all the time because we would get like soft locked at this one point near the volcano over and over again. But we'd be like, oh, let's make new characters, let's name them different stuff. And again, that was a lot of the experience. It was just so much fun because in that era, games were short, man. You would play for like a couple hours, like Mega Man or something, and like that's the game. And like we had the Nintendo at our grandma's house, and we would go and like play Mega Man for like an hour and then go home. You know, that's how you played games back then. They weren't these sweeping, massive, narrative experiences. So yeah, we would go and play Final Fantasy and then just restart every time, and we didn't beat it till we were much older because it's too hard, So I think it's great, and so much replayability, so much magic, imagination. Everybody knows you name it after your best friends and everything. That's a common. So yeah.
Yeah, I think it plays a big part into the individual experience. And I only played through the game once, and because of that, I went with the classic thing that it recommends to you, which is Warrior, Thief, Black Mage, and White Mage. And in my playthrough, I was like, "Damn, this thief is like useless." But everyone in chat was like, "No, it's not. I promise. It's really good once you level him up and blah blah blah."
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So it's like okay. Because at first it was just like dying every 2 hits because its HP and defense are so low, I guess. But it's also dealing more damage than my warrior in most cases, and then which is really nice. Like at the end of the game, when you get the job upgrades and stuff like that, you get the Masamune, which is like which is really good. Yeah, that was dealing a ridiculous amount of damage. In fact, it was funny. The sword trail is purple and stuff too, at least in the pixel remaster. So I found that to be a little funny.
Oh, like Sephiroth? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Awesome, right?
Yeah.
Those little details, man.
Yeah. But like other than that, like the speedrunning scene and the randomizer scene for this game are so big, I think, because of the amount of like it's almost like Pokemon to an extent where you can have so much customization in your party with the different job classes and how they improve once you do upgrade them in the future, because they all bring different things to the table. They all can learn different kinds of magic. Even the warrior and the thief can learn magic once you upgrade their classes and stuff. So that was really interesting. And I think like I know that people do challenge runs all the time of like 4 white mage playthroughs, 4 black mage, 4 warrior playthroughs, stuff.
I was just gonna say the all white mage is like a classic challenge. Yeah, that's like for not the faint of heart. Yeah.
Not the faint of heart.
All 4 white mages is insane. I never actually made a run like that before.
And I just think that's awesome that people have that amount of customization going into it from the word go. As soon as you boot up the game, you make your characters, you name them, and you choose their job. So that's awesome. And this is where obviously the job system even came from in the first place. So but what do you guys think? How about you, Hylian and ST? I don't know why I said both of your names, but
both go now.
Hurry.
I think Hylian can go first.
All right. Well, I actually I love the amount of options that you have at hand from the beginning. You guys basically covered most of my thoughts as well. Like, I think the one of the big things that Final Fantasy really like blew, one of the reasons why it blew up was precisely because of the job system and how you could customize your characters and how many of each class could be in your party. A lot of people back then, from what I've heard from people at the time, like they they always shared each other's parties. Like, man, I finished this game with like 3 white mages and like a thief, or 1 black mage and 3 warriors, etc. Like the guy wanted to be OP or something. And but yeah, like it's just fantastic. Like, it gives the game a lot of personality, but also considering like how it was a game that you really needed to stay in that class. There still weren't class changes at the time. You really needed to commit. So
Yeah.
I think there is and I think this also extends a bit to the magic system. We're gonna get there, but I think one of the big things that I like about Final Fantasy 1 is how much there is this high risk, high reward in terms of your investment in your party and how you administrate your magic, how you organize everything. Like, it really created this this huge amount of options for the players to experiment. And one of the it's actually interesting. One of the interviews with the battle director, he even said that when they were designing the job system, they were looking into Dungeons and Dragons, and they wanted people. He didn't even want to consider balancing the game. So a lot of people were talking about, how about beating the game with like 4 thieves? They weren't even thinking about that because they were more concerned about the players wanting to experiment. That was his main. That was his main idea. So this kind of really lived up to the expectations in Final Fantasy 1. Like, there were, of course, as Philip said, like there are some people who end up reaching a wall because of their decisions, but that's part of the fun in a way. Like, managing to learn like what are the limitations of each class. And I think the biggest one of the most exciting moments in the game was precisely upgrading everyone with Bahamut. Like, even the characters that didn't learn how to use magic, now they can, etc. Like, that was a very big, even a narrative moment in some sense. Like, you see this growth that other RPGs at the time didn't have. So again, this is the customization, etc. These are things that come a lot from their background, like their influences, but it also kind of defined Final Fantasy, like a big part of their appeal because of their execution.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with all that. You know, I just, for me, I really appreciated how much customization there really was. I was a bit surprised by it too, considering the game's age. You know, the job system stuff, it was great to see that. You know, I played Final Fantasy 9. It's one of the few I've played, so, you know, it's like going back to Final Fantasy 1, it's like, oh, yeah, okay. That's how, okay. Makes sense. So, but yeah, I really liked just how much customization there was, because it really just adds to the replay value. It's kind of a game where, and every time you would boot it up to start a new game, you can just do something different, and you don't really get that in a lot of RPGs nowadays, I think. You know?
Yeah.
Where you can make these little changes that will just add up to being really a different experience.
Yep. Agreed. Okay. And that's like where I compared it to Pokemon as well. Like, even like the original Red, Blue, Yellow, and stuff like that. It kind of takes a page out of the Final Fantasy 1's book there, and does it like tenfold with the amount of customization you have in the Pokemon and stuff.
Yeah, and I think the very emotional payoff that the player gets by seeing their Pokemon evolve, I think it kind of drew a bit from the class evolution in Final Fantasy 1 as well. Like,
interesting.
When you talk to people who played Final Fantasy 1 back in the day, one of the main highlights that people say is like, man, I loved when I got to see my party evolve. Like
Yep.
that's one of the big highlights, because it makes the player feel a lot more powerful, that the journey is really paying off to them, both in like in terms of fun, but also like you can see that you're getting stronger, you're having even more access to magic, to abilities, etc. So I think Pokemon drew that from that as well.
Very cool. And I guess like moving forward, we'll go into a couple discussion topics that'll probably be the ones where I have like the biggest love-hate relationship with it, going back to a classic game like this, which is traversing the overworld, exploration, and like how talking to NPCs plays into where you have to go next, etc., etc. I don't know how the encounter rate is in the original NES or GBA or PSP ports, but it's very high in the Pixel Remaster. I know that.
It's higher, I think, in the original. I hate to say it.
Oh boy!
It's
Oh
insane.
goodness gracious!
It's insane
Yeah.
in the original.
I
There's a
don't wanna think
hallway in
about
the
that,
original.
then.
There's a hallway in the original where every step is a fight with like I think it's like 4 or 8
Giants.
giants. Yeah, every
Hall of Giants.
single step.
Exactly.
And you just like I guess I'll turn back, and then every step back is and you just
Oh
die.
man!
It's insane. Yeah.
And like
Yeah.
it's like hard for me because it's not like I have anything against random encounters and stuff like that, but it's different when you don't know where you're supposed to go.
Oh, yeah.
And like I guess this is where like a player's guide would come in when you like on the original NES. There was a point in the game where like if I can't figure something out at this point because I'm streaming the whole thing, I'm going to look at a guide, because like I'm trying to remember everything that the NPCs are saying. I'm talking to everyone, etc., but they don't tell you exactly what to do. There'll be like one NPC that's like, oh, in few instances they will. There's one who's like, oh, there's someone in a cave above here that will give you something. I can't remember exactly what it is, but there are like mixed messages when you talk to the NPCs, to the point where you don't necessarily know what you have to do next. And because of that, it can make the random encounters feel very, very, very monotonous. Especially when they're giving you like no EXP, like when you're traveling on the boat and stuff like that. But at the same time, I love the idea of having to like go talk to everyone, like write things down, remember it, and try to figure out piece by piece what you have to do next. I just hate that I'm hitting a random encounter every 2 seconds while I'm doing that. You know what I mean? It just feels like,
every
here we
5
go
seconds.
again. Here we go again. Like I kind of want to move forward, maybe fight some stronger enemies, get to the next fiend, etc. What do you guys think about this? Because it's like, this is the biggest part of the game where I was like, yeah, this is showing that it's Final Fantasy 1. Like, it's like, yes, this is a video game.
Well, I think the main thing is like the question becomes not so much like you just said, it's an old game, you know?
Yeah.
It becomes not so much like is this an outdated mechanic, which it is. It's more like, should they completely erase it in a remaster which is designed to kind of preserve these experiences, right? So again, just to say, in the original, the encounter rate is so much worse. There is no auto battle in the original. You can speed things up so much in the new one. You can skip right through it. You also level faster in the new one. It's like there's a lot of quality of life stuff that you were fighting just endlessly more in the beginning. So I think they did a great job preserving it as the experience that it was and updating it with little quality of life things. Like the map and the auto battle alone have like completely transformed that experience. Because part of the biggest gameplay exploration experience for me and my brother was, we're inside the marsh cave or the volcano or whatever, and you don't have a map. So you're just wandering around for hours and then trying to remember where you went and stuff, trying to draw out maps and stuff. Really big, fun part of the experience. Again, back then, nowadays, you'd be like, what the hell is this game doing? Why am I drawing a map? Like, it's ridiculous. You'd never expect that, right? Or you think it's unacceptable, but back then it was fun. You know, we were just like, this is crazy. We're lost in this volcano. You really feel like you're on an adventure. Again, only because it's so imaginative. You're able to kind of like immerse yourself in there and be like, wow, I feel like I'm on a journey. This is crazy. Which I think they did the best they could to preserve that. I think they should not have taken away the maps in the new one. That would have been a bit too much. So I think it's good.
Yeah.
I think they did great. If someone's really wants to go back and get that experience, you can, right? But like I still have my NES, right? But I don't think many should be asked to do so.
I was
Very
very happy to have masks. I mean, masks, yeah, no.
Maps. Oh yeah, we got
No,
plenty of those
no,
nowadays.
maps in the dungeons specifically. Because without them, I mean, eventually I got conditioned to just explore everything anyway, because the dungeons kind of force you to with the certain story items you need, unless you're gonna go back for them. Spoilers, I guess, but yeah, you kind of want to open almost every chest up into a point just to, because I don't know the exact chest that these items are in. So, and I was going to get new equipment and loot anyway, so I wanted to get as much gil as I can. I know the shops, like, things are a lot more expensive and stuff like that than in like the GBA PSP ports and beyond. So
Yeah,
that's a thing.
Like, again, we got soft locked at the volcano. I forget the particular town's name right there. It just escaped me. But like, yeah, stuff was too expensive. We were too weak. We like barely survived and got there. So then we were dying at the random encounters outside in the river with the canoe. We couldn't buy stuff because we had no money, and we're like, what do we do? So it was just like very easy to get stuck in the old one.
The one thing I will say is, real quick before you go, Hylian, is that like I appreciate the fact that they did try to preserve the original, in the sense that, you know, you have to hit all the random encounters, and it did make some things easier with the auto battle and whatnot. But like, fleeing is still not like that viable. Like, you're better off in most cases just beating the enemies that are in front of you, because it's a lot faster than like, you don't know whether or not you're going to get a fast flee or not. The chances are pretty low. So I never like to see an option taken away that like another port has for like convenience for new players. Like, I wish there was like a turn random encounters off. You know how like Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 have those like cheats for players that are trying to get into them in the ports?
Right.
Yeah.
I like, that's one thing. Well, one of many criticisms I will say about the Pixel Remaster is that, like, I don't know why Square decided to take away those options at all. Like, it doesn't have to be that way by default, of course. Like, you want to preserve that experience, but why doesn't it have that option? I find it strange.
Oh, you mean like battle boost and stuff?
Or just like turn off random encounters in like the Overworld and stuff. Because
I didn't know that was a part of the PSP, but I never played that
Oh
particular
no,
version.
I mean, like, it's a part of like the Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 ports. Like, they have it in like other ports. So now that they're doing these new ports for 1 through 6, they had the chance to throw them in there as a convenience for new players, and they opted out of doing that. And I find that strange.
Yeah, it's not really consistent like with their other parts. I agree with you. Like, I think at least there should be an option for different types of players to experience it. I think that Final Fantasy 1 is the kind of game that there are some brutal difficulty spikes. I think that the Marsh Cave is probably the most notorious one. Like, it's easily the one that really shows you, like, holy shit, I need to grind. You know, it's a game that actually kind of incentivizes you to grind. So when you said, Juice, that it's quicker to battle instead of just trying to flee. You're going to have, if you flee, you're going to pay the bills later. Like, you're probably going to run into the risk of having those mandatory boss battles take a lot longer than they needed to. So with regards to battle encounters, like to random encounters, I'm sorry. I personally have I don't mind the system. I very much enjoy the fact that it exists, because random encounters kind of make enemy density in an area, even on a narrative level, kind of makes sense. Like, you don't need to see every enemy on the map, you know. It's kind of like in your imagination, like, oh, here they're finding this enemy here, and here. So it's different from a game where you see every enemy on screen, and if you have something like Final Fantasy VII Remake, for example, like, there are certain soldiers that are here. And sometimes you wonder, like, well, there is this facility here that could make good use of better security if they had these enemies here. But in the original, you would have random encounters here, so you would have a much larger room for imagination. I think what Philip said about Final Fantasy 1 being a game of imagination is probably one of its biggest appeals, and a lot of that comes into the random encounters. Now,
Mm.
so I don't have an issue with those. I think that a game could exist today with random encounters like Fantasian, like it
Yeah.
released recently from Mistwalker. It's amazing, like from what people are saying. And it's more like how often do these battle encounters show up? And what Juice said, I hear often a lot of people saying like, "Wow, the NES titles they have a lot of random encounters," and I agree. Actually, I think that that's one of the criticisms that I have with for the NES games, even for that time. Okay, even looking at the context, like you can tell that a lot of these RPGs they had higher encounter rates to bloat the time for
Yeah.
consumers to play the game because games were short back then and they still cost like full price. Like actually back then they were even more expensive than they are now, depending on where you lived. Like there were some games like Final Fantasy 1 you could buy for like full price at $70, $70 back then, like
Yep.
depending on the conversion. So if you are paying that much money for a video game, you need to really make good use of your time with that work. And a lot of the time that you expand with that game is through having more battle encounters. So that's a way that many developers back then artificially bloated the game time. So that's something that I don't think is particularly, or I would say normatively good for the medium. A lot of people were drawn away from that genre precisely because of this. So I agree with you, Juice. I think that there should be an option, like maybe a bar of like how much, like maybe lowering by half, like the encounter rate. That would
Yeah.
be a good idea, having like a slider. But as it is, in the NES version is insane. If you thought that the Pixel remaster was tough, you should, the original one was even
Oh,
more insane.
yeah. I didn't find the game tough. In fact, because of the random encounters, I found it very easy at a certain
You got
point.
strong. Yeah.
Yeah, I got like super overpowered.
Overpowered. Yeah. But like it
yeah.
becomes more draining in that sense. Like the experience
Right.
becomes a lot more like, I gave 3 steps and another encounter, and it
Yep.
kind of drains out like your
Mhm.
hype and your
I
experience.
will say I've been playing FF6 and that one feels very good as far as the enemy encounters. Like there's like
Yeah.
a few battles per dungeon I'm through, and I've
Oh,
played it
wow.
several times, so I'm just like plowing through it to listen to the music and
Yeah.
see the story, and it feels like very good. It's just I'm pretty sure they were trying to kind of retain that experience of the original. Like I said, it's kind of a tough balance, right? Do you completely change the experience? I think if they end up doing, because that's what we have to remember, these are kind of like they are technically remakes, right? Because they're not using like the same engine and kind of like putting in new assets and tweaking them.
Yeah.
So it is like a full remake, but they're kind of made to archive that experience for people who, you know, it's
Mhm.
widescreen now, and so it's accessible
Yeah.
for people today who don't have as much time and everything. So it's kind of a tough topic. Whereas the ports that you mentioned, like 7 through 9, are actually just ports. Like they just kind of
Yeah.
like quality of life. They're not even widescreen. They're not even really updated. They're certainly not remakes. And that FF9 port, I think, is the worst port I've ever played in my life. And it's funny.
Oh,
'cause
really?
it's horrible. Yeah, because it has like, and I love FF9. It was one of my favorites for the PS1 era, just in general. And because it has like fat finger mode, because it's literally the cell phone port that they put on PS4.
Oh,
So
Yeah.
like when you're menuing, how important is menuing in Final Fantasy? It's like half of what
Yeah.
you do. If
Yeah.
you hit it like 3 times, it moves once. Beep. Because it's made like so you don't like hit it with your fat fingers on your phone. So it's just like
Exactly.
so insanely frustrating. And the battles in FF9 are already so insanely slow and frustrating.
Yeah.
It's just like But yeah, besides that, the models looked really good, like the uncompressed 3D models. But besides
yeah,
that,
those looked really nice. Wait, what did you play it on?
goodness.
Steam or?
I played it on PS4. The port.
PS4. Okay, I played mine on Switch, but and I never had any problems with menuing. But I wasn't necessarily trying to like menu really fast because that's before I'd gotten good at menuing from like speedrunning 7.
Well,
which
it's just because I played it. It's just because I played
Yeah.
it before too. I'm like trying. Okay,
Yeah.
I know what to do. Let's do that.
makes sense.
But so it was more glaring because I had already played the OG. But that was awful.
One thing that I wanted to also add to the discussion, because Juice also mentioned like progression and dungeons, etc., and how
Mhm.
NPCs work. Like from my experience playing it, okay, maybe it's just my philosophy of playing it, but I feel like Final Fantasy 1 really rewards players who explore absolutely everything in a
Yeah.
town or in a castle, etc., before you leave. Because
Yeah.
if you don't, you're going to have to go back there. So every time I do this with every game I play, like Zelda, Mario, etc. Like I talk to every NPC because I really want to be drawn into this world, into like what's the culture of this town, like what are the things that are in their minds, like is there a conflict going on, etc. And sometimes you get a necessary item, like in the in the very beginning of the game, where you need to get the loot to finish the game. And if you don't talk to Princess Sarah, you're screwed. You're going to have to go back to the very first castle and get the loot. A lot of people skipped that and suffered because of it. There are some chests that you need to get, so everything you need to explore. In that sense, I think that maybe it's designed for a specific play style and it kind of undermines others. I understand the criticism, I really do, but at least to me, I didn't suffer as much from this issue. I find it that like the pacing of the game, even though it's very open-ended, they really want you to explore this linear path of these towns to get all the necessary information for your progress, so that when you fight these enemies in these areas and you get through this part of the story, you have everything in hand to go through, etc. So I don't know if you guys agree. I wanted to hear more from you guys in this aspect, because there are a lot of people that I talk to that have very different play styles. So I wanted to know if do you guys share this? Do you guys have a different? Do you guys plow through everything or go half and half? How do you guys do it?
The game, I'll do what the game conditions me to do. With Final Fantasy 1, it conditioned me to explore everything. Because of the fact that you're going to need it. Like, making the mistake once of not having something and then having to go back into the dungeon made me like, okay, I'm just going to explore every single thing in the dungeon anyway. And it's interesting, the fact that the Pixel Remaster has the map that allows you to see where all the chests are as well definitely helps with that. Yeah. I guess like this is why I say I have a love-hate relationship with this system, because I love random encounters, don't get me wrong. It's for the exact reasons that you guys were saying. My problem comes in where like I'm on the overworld and I literally don't know where to go at all, even when like talking to all the NPCs. Like I have a few ideas of where I have to go, but let's say I make that one mistake of like going the wrong way around the world and just going to the wrong place and then having to travel like all the way back. Before you have the airship or anything like that, it makes it very painful to have to go all the way back through and fight these enemies that are like super especially like early games specifically.
It's a symptom of modern gaming too. Like it's just back then we were so like, I don't even know how to describe it. It was just so crazy to even see a battle, and every enemy encounter was awesome. And so it's just different today when you're like, like we don't even know what random encounters are. You know, we're just playing like, this is crazy. Well, there's monsters and stuff. So I think it's just, again, like I said, I would never make anybody try to love something they don't. But I mean, it's one of the games that not only started this entire franchise and kind of, you know, was the jumping off point for it, but also so, like you mentioned, Pokemon. So many other RPGs that are iconic at this point are inspired by Final Fantasy. So I think it is good they preserved the original experience and didn't just be like, it's not as fun nowadays, let's change it, because it's cool from like a gaming historical context for people to go back and be like, oh, this is the game that like inspired all these franchises. So I think, again, it's who knows what the right answer is, but I think they did a good job. And I think if they'd included like the battle boost and all that stuff, like with the 9 port, it might have been a bit much, because if it's there, you're probably going to use it. And it's just like, it probably takes that experience away for a lot of people. But I don't know. I'm sure other people might just say more options are better, as is the case certainly with accessibility, right? And like difficulty levels. Yeah. So maybe they could have just done like an easy mode. I don't know. There's different solutions.
Yeah, I think easy. Go ahead before I go.
I was going to say, the only thing of those battle boosts, like even for like 9 and 7 ports that I would even consider using, would just be sometimes, all right, I'm going to turn off the encounters because I just...
Yeah, precisely.
Stop it, you know. But that said, I really do like the random encounters for, again, like I said, the imagination aspect of it. But I don't really have much else to say beyond that, because you guys pretty much said what I would have said.
Yeah, and like I would say that the option is good to like 9 and 7 were my two first, and I never used battle boosts. I think
Yeah.
the only thing that I did was like okay, like somewhere in the middle of the game I was okay, I literally don't know where to go at all. I'm gonna have to like go throughout the entire overworld to figure it out, and I'm
Yeah.
streaming it. I'm going to turn off random encounters and turn on like the super speed or whatever, so I can figure out what to do. And I feel like that's those options are kind of important for some new players. Like just have them in a menu somewhere. At least that's what I would say. But to get back to your point, Hylian, I also like talked to every single NPC in every single town and
Yeah.
like went
It's
in
fun,
with
yeah.
like every corner in the dungeon because I want to get as much as I possibly can out of the world itself, like you were saying. And it's really interesting to see, like you said, the cultures, the story, the world building, because this game does most of its story through its world building, akin to some other games that we'll eventually get to.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat.
Yeah, that reminds me. I didn't answer Hylian's question of like, do I either just rush through things or do I take my time? I'm very much a guy with pretty much any game I play. I like to take my time, absorb the world and the story and what's going on in it. I don't like just the full speed ahead because unless I'm playing, I don't know, like a Sonic game or something where that's the point. But
Yeah.
in a lot of story-focused games like Final Fantasy or Zelda or whatever, I'm always taking my time.
Oh.
And
You offended him.
I can't believe it.
Was it something?
I talked about Zelda and everything.
Yeah. He's
Oh,
even got
no.
the Zelda picture in the back. Oh, T-Link.
Oh, he says
Come on,
he's
man.
got a connection problem. He'll return quickly. Okay.
Yeah,
Well, I guess I'm
yeah,
like on
okay.
my screen. I'm like half and half. I can go to either the left side or the right side now on the
Yeah,
on
just
the
like,
stream.
let's
That's
move
really
you.
funny. But what I was going to say before he comes back is that it really depends on the game too, because if the game is conditioning me to, or it's not,
Yeah.
it's like not giving me any information when I am talking to everyone in the towns or
I
I
was just
am
gonna say that.
exploring, then
Yeah.
I am going to be like, okay, obviously, if I miss something, then I guess I miss something, and I just kind of, like
Yeah.
whatever.
It doesn't matter as much.
Yeah. So,
I'm kind of in between with what a lot of you guys said. Like for me, it kind of is dependent on what the art makes me feel I should do or what the art inspires me to do.
yeah.
Like I always talk about, we definitely have some Zelda fans here. I always talk about Breath of the Wild, like reviving my faith in video games, essentially as like a kind of like a joyful, just kind of imaginative experience. Because when I look at like Ocarina of Time, which is like one of my favorite games ever, what I played as a kid, like I was just running around, like talking about imagination and stuff, just running around for the fun. I just wanted to run through Hyrule Field because it looks awesome and I want to see what's over there, right? But a lot of video games, I feel, especially like PS3 era, really got into this kind of like, it just feels like homework, man. It's like talk to NPC. There's
Yeah.
a map on the screen. Go follow the arrow and then just talk to another NPC and then do that. It's just like, it's so formulaic and it's so
Yeah.
not joyful. So I was playing Breath of the
agree,
Wild.
yeah.
Do you see what I'm saying? Yeah. Breath of the Wild comes out and I turn it on and I'm just like, for the first time in I don't know how long, I'm just like, I don't even care if there's a quest. I don't care if I get any reward. I just want to run up there and climb because I'm stupid and it looks fun. I just want to like jump off that thing and like see what's down there and throw a rock and stuff. It's just fun. Like it feels like you're a kid again running around. And I feel like a lot of games lost that for a long time. So I'm actually, yeah. Do you guys agree?
I
Yeah,
do, and
I
I
do
think
agree.
Zelda is special in that regard of like it keeps
Yeah.
that kind of progression that it's always had, and just of the progression of Link feeling more powerful the further you get and things like that, and even though not all the NPCs you'll talk to, if it's meaningful, you learn something more about the world or the lore.
Yeah. Or it's
that
just fun,
enriches
right?
you. Yeah.
Or it's just like
it's
some
just a
fun
thing to
moment
do.
or something. Yeah. And that's kind of my point. In Zelda, like I'm laughing and I'm talking to people, and in Breath of the Wild, it's like, oh, that's funny. But I don't feel like I have to. I don't feel like it's homework. And like I think that's the
you don't
big,
ever have to.
yeah, that's the big difference. Like whoever I talk to, it's gonna be great. If I have to talk to somebody, it's gonna be clear. It's gonna be obvious. It's not gonna be like we joke. You miss one chest, you gotta go trek like 90 hours back. So I think that's what that's something I really respect in games is when it kind of I can infer from the art what I'm supposed to do, and just kind of have a good time. And no matter what I do, I'm gonna get rewarded for it. And I think that's the big the only thing that matters in gaming and in general. You shouldn't be forced to, suffer if you don't want to or do stuff
Yeah.
differently.
Yeah, and that's kind of Breath of the Wild's entire philosophy is the freedom of choice
Yeah.
in like everything,
Mhm.
not just exploration, but also the battle system and like the physics and everything else like that. And it really
Totally.
makes it a really fun gaming experience.
The
Breath of
amount
the Wild for me, most of the fun comes from everything other than the main quest. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
yeah, the amount of things that Link can do in that game, it's insane.
Yeah. You can run around like a lunatic for like 200 hours and have the best time ever, and not even touch the story, and that's what makes it a really unique game.
Yeah. And hopefully Hylian comes back
I was
before
gonna
we
say,
get
hopefully he
like
comes back.
too deep into this because I know Philip, you don't have like all the time in the world today, or at least that's what you had said originally. So,
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm not sure I do
I'm sorry
either.
about that delay because my endless looping sound or whatever, so we can go a little bit longer.
oh, it's so
fine.
good.
Yeah.
Yeah, because we like finishing up on like the gameplay with the battle system, items, magic, and balancing, and then
I was
starting
gonna
to
say, I
get
guess
into
we can
like
start with
some of the
that,
other stuff.
but-
Yeah, we'll move on, and then listen. If he comes back, he can come back and lend his voice to any of those topics that we might have missed with
Yeah.
him. Let's
Yeah.
keep going. Yeah.
So I think I'll start here. So the battle system, unless if I just missed it, this seems to be complete turn-based combat and not ATB.
Yeah,
You know,
it
obviously
is.
with Final Fantasy, I'm more used
Mhm.
to ATB, and this, well, the combat's fine. You know, again, I played the Pixel Remaster, so it's pretty snappy and quick. I like that about it. You know, the job system, all that, the magic, all that's fine. It ticks off the right boxes. But what it really made me think about was how much it made me actually appreciate ATB in Final Fantasy specifically.
Yep.
Because with other RPGs I've played where it's complete turn-based is like Paper Mario. And Paper Mario, it's more immersive for me because of like the command prompts you have to do for your attacks. You know, you want Mario to do this specific move, you have to do the inputs correctly. But you still have all the time in the world to make your decisions and all that. So I kind of like what Final Fantasy VII would do, where yeah, you have all these options and all that, but you need to be a bit hasty about it because if you're just standing there taking your time, Cloud's gonna get hit in the face like 10 times. And
If you have
look, he's
active on,
dead.
yeah.
Yeah,
I'm really curious what you think of FF10 if you get a chance to play it.
I haven't played 10 yet, but
Yeah, because it's
eventually.
a really cool. It's turn based. It's not ATB, but
not ATB.
they add this different awesome strategic element where. And Juice, have you played FF10?
Not yet.
Not yet. Oh, I'm really
Hylian
excited to see you
has,
guys
but
because it has yeah, he'll be back. It has this awesome turn-based system, but there's a whole added strategy of number one, character switching. You can switch in, like you have people on the field, but you can switch out the rest of your party. So you're constantly like, okay, who do I need
There it
here?
is.
Also, turn order changes depending on choices that you make. So it's like, okay, if I use this magic, I'll save another turn for later, but like I might get to heal, and it just becomes this really fun kind of cerebral game. So I'm curious what you guys think.
Yeah, I mean, like for Final Fantasy 1, going back to a battle system like this is always really interesting because like my experience with battle system mostly comes from ATB, ATB turn-based, like usually active from stuff like Final Fantasy 7 and 9. Speedrunning Final Fantasy 7 specifically has taught me a whole heck of a lot about ATB.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's crazy because like going into a game where you have no control over the turn order whatsoever. At least I don't think so. It kind of just seems to be random whether or not the enemies strike first or like who in your party strikes first. I could be missing something completely here, but like you can't like switch to another member. It's certain like things don't have priority over something else. Whereas something in like Final Fantasy VII, you can switch characters, queue different things up, and certain things take priority over other things. Like for example, a limit break will always take priority over anything else, which allows you to get an extra turn in on a boss or something like that. Nothing like that exists in here. So going back to something so basic was fine. I get like it got a lot better when I got like more magic charges, because when I get into encounters where I fight 9 enemies and I don't have ethers like at the beginning of the game and stuff like that, then you have to be very cautious with your magic usage, with your magic charges, which is like the original NES and the Pixel Remaster have magic charges. The GBA and PSP ports have MP. They don't have magic charges, which allows you to use your magic a lot more freely. Which is why I do like the Pixel Remaster for preserving that exact thing, like you were saying earlier, because it brings in a different dynamic to the battle system. At a certain point, it doesn't matter because you have like you have 99 ethers and you just,
Also, guess what didn't exist in the original? I'm pretty sure, somebody correct me. I don't think
Phoenix
ethers
Down?
existed. No Phoenix Down. Pretty sure there's no ethers and there's no high potions.
No
You
ether.
were just like,
Oh my
that game
God.
is so hard. Like the end dungeon and stuff. Good luck. Like it is it's part RNG, it's part just insane strategy, but it was like you had to be on point, man. It felt so intense. And I remember playing the Pixar. I'm like, what? There's Phoenix Downs, like there's ethers and stuff. So it was so difficult. Just for more context there.
Yeah, that's very different from the Pixel Remaster, because in the Pixel Remaster, at a certain point, battles just became like nothing because you just get so much gil. I'm just getting all these ethers, all the high potions, whatever I need. I don't have to worry about magic at that point, which is whatever. That's a completely different experience to the original, I guess. Go ahead, Hylian.
Totally.
Welcome back.
Hi. Well, yeah, I'm sorry I had a connection issue here. So you guys are talking about the magic system, etc., and balancing.
we're talking about
Pixel Remaster is indeed much easier in that aspect. We didn't have many of these items that recovered a lot of these stats. You just had these magic charges, and you had to pray to God that those magic hit the enemies, because there were a lot of ineffective hits. Yeah, when
Just
you see the ineffective, those were like pure horror. Like, oh no, this guy's gonna one hit KO my party. Like there were a lot of situations like that. But there is also a different side to this, that the original version had less levels. So the max level in the original was 50. And Pixel Remaster, I think it's level 90, right? Not level 99 or something like that. I'm not sure.
Probably.
I know they raised a ton, and in the original we had less levels. We didn't have these items, which is precisely why white mages were crucial for a lot of parties. If you want to play it casually, if you don't have a white mage, good luck, because white mage is the one in the party that can revive your character full, either 1 HP or full health. Like they were everything. Like they were your item. So and you couldn't use I think you couldn't even use recovery items during the battle. Actually, you needed to beat the enemy, and you needed to open the start menu so that you can use the potions that you bought in stores. And by the way, when you were buying potions, you bought one at a time. Exactly. You knew what I was gonna say.
2 hours to buy 50 potions.
Oh my goodness.
90. You
That's
were
funny.
you needed to buy like 99 potions all at once. Like you weren't like, I want 99 potions, please, and you just have one buyout. No, you needed to do that 99 times.
So that's why, like, for us playing this Pixel Remaster, it's like,
it's
so,
about
this
is the kind of
the
thing
things
that
that
is
you wouldn't
actually
even
great.
think of. Yeah, it's the stuff you would never even think could exist.
And this is why in this aspect of the Pixel Remaster, I really enjoyed, like, this quality of life is crucial, like, to really have a good experience, because this game could be a lot better. Like, if you play the original NES version, like, there are a lot of things that you actually won't find in any other version afterwards that I really want to talk about, especially in terms of story. But
Sure.
in terms of the actual experience, it could have been a 10 out of 10, no joke. Like, on a personal level, like, subjectively speaking, I would give it like a 9 out of 10, a 9.5 out of 10. But normatively speaking, in terms of like mechanics and how they work, and you can tell that it wasn't the best programmed game. And when you look into the development history, you can see why. But really, it's like an 8 out of 10 game at best in terms of like its mechanics, because a lot of weapons, a lot of these scenarios that could have been a lot better, a lot more simplified, couldn't have been done so because of programming issues. And one of the reasons for this wasn't that the programmer was incompetent. Okay, they hired this huge programmer from India, I think, or Pakistan. He's called Nasir, and he was a very big figure back then. But he never programmed for an RPG before. So a lot of the mechanics, they were telling him like, "Oh, do this, do that," and he had like little to no guidance exactly on how these things worked. He just had to make them function. So a lot of the things that you see in the original is precisely like, oh, it's inconvenient, etc., because of these tough situations back then. So this is one of the reasons why I would suggest people to give the Pixel remaster a shot, like over the original, because of stuff like this. I think that as a fan of the original, at least this is a remake that I enjoy. I'm not too big of a fan of the of like how they treated the Lufenians, etc., but I will get there.
I like your use of the word normative instead of just straight up saying objectively bad programming, because it's what like we've come to expect as like people who play video games, and not just straight up like objective as in like things that exist in the game, period.
Oh yeah,
like this thing is red.
Yeah, objectivity in programming is more like, is this thing objectively working as intended or not? Because programming, you can determine a lot more like functionality on an objective level because of how its language is categorized, like how it works. So there is a certain logic that you can always reproduce. But normativity is more like, when you use the word good and bad, like that's fundamentally a normative and or subjective thing, a subjective idea. So we tend to consider bad programming normatively when you have a scenario where, you have a programming here that is functional, but it's not as efficient as it normatively should. You know, stuff like buying potions one after the other instead of just buying 99 potions at once. Like that's a programming challenge that you can opt for two different types of solutions, but normatively speaking, we tend to say something is good when it's more efficient. So that's why normatively the original suffers from that level.
And what you get from those experiences is purely subjective. So like some people, so some people might be like, "Hey, I have good experiences buying one potion at a time because it made me laugh," or something like that, or it made me appreciate that. Like, I mean, it made me appreciate my time in the shop. I don't know, but like...
In that aspect, yes. Like when you were saying like the troubles of like going through a dungeon, etc., and having like every step like. You remember the Hall of Giants, Philip? Like, I remember playing this and actually having fun. Like, I laughed every time. I was like, wait, is it every step? And I tried every time. It was like, holy shit, it's real. Like, it was funny for me in that aspect. But I know that there are a lot of people who have a very different experience. So that's the magic of subjectivity. But those are things that can be separated. So when I say that something is normatively good or bad, it doesn't necessarily delete that you had a good or bad experience.
There's a game called Quest 64. I doubt you guys have played it.
I know it. I haven't played it.
I did. Yeah. We had almost no RPGs on the N64. Like Quest 64 was one of the few options.
So it's one of me and my brother's favorite games because we played it when we were like little kids. We love it. And of course it is like used as like the I don't even know what's called, the garbage can of like the worst RPG ever made. Like it's made fun of and used as like it's literally like a stream punish game, like as incentives. Like I'll play this game if we hit 1,000 subs and stuff, and then like laugh through it. But like for us, it is so much fun, and I could write an essay on why I love that game so much and why it's such a fun experience, especially back then. Again, a lot of imagination and stuff. But by like today's RPG standard, it's going to be quite lacking in a few ways. So it's just another example of what you're saying, right?
Yeah,
like we
wonderful
so
example as well. I'm actually glad to have met a fan of Quest 64. That's actually a very cool thing.
Love it.
Moving forward, I guess we can start talking about like magic and some of the balancing around it. I know in the original NES port, some of the magic just like doesn't work. I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but that's what I had.
You're correct.
I had heard, some of the magic just straight up doesn't work, which is Awesome.
Funny.
But but other than that, like I
Awesome.
guess like the one thing that I didn't like or that I didn't understand at first is that while I like the fact that like the game forces you to, at least at the beginning of the game, you have to be pretty conservative with your magic usage and exactly where you want to use it. I think that's a cool idea in concept. Like I said, Pixel Remaster about like halfway through the game kind of destroys it with the amount of like
Ether,
items, ethers and everything else, which is fine too, just for convenience sake. You don't have to use it, hey. But the one thing is like I would try to buy like black magic or white magic that I should have been able to use because that was the right level to use, and you can't equip it because I didn't know why at first, but it was because you have to upgrade your job. So I found that to be a little strange at first, just because there's no explanation on it. It's just like I've been conditioned at this point throughout the game to be like, okay, I can equip magic that I reach a certain level to because it says I have this amount of magic charges for it, but then I couldn't equip it. So I found that to be strange, just a little quirk of the game. I guess that it wasn't something that wasn't like too explained, at least that I didn't talk to anyone that explained it until like later when you were able to upgrade your job. But other than that, as far as balancing goes, because like I was saying earlier, because of the fact that the game kind of conditions you to fight everyone instead of fleeing from them, I was like so over leveled at a point, or at least it felt like I was so over leveled at a point where it almost felt like it was taking away from the game experience because of the fact that I was just destroying like all the bosses except for the final boss, and I did run into Warmech. So that was one
Warmech,
thing.
classic.
Yeah, that was one thing that I was like,
fought him in the remaster too. Yeah.
it's like, oh, this is just what I like. I knew he existed, that it existed, but like I completely forgot. So it's just like, oh, I'm just gonna whatever. Finally, another encounter. I'll just defeat it. And I was like, why isn't it dead? Why is it doing so much damage? Why is it healing 100 HP every single turn? What is going? And then I was like, oh, that's what it is. Now I remember.
You ran into that randomly. You didn't like look for it.
Yeah, I ran into it randomly. Like
That's
on the.
So I spent
Wow.
4 hours on the Pixel Remaster looking for
Yeah,
him.
it was
And
my
you just
first
hit him.
encounter on the screen on
The
the top
bridge?
floor. Yeah, on the bridge. It was my
That's
first
wild.
encounter, and I was like,
You have the luck of the gods. I would just say right now.
Yeah, that's crazy.
yeah.
It's supposed to be a 1 in 64 chance, but I don't
Yeah.
know,
Oh,
man.
okay.
After that 4
Bro,
hours.
just have good RNG. It's that easy.
Yeah.
it's true.
And then other
Yes.
than that,
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
I think that like the magic's pretty good. I didn't know that you could like hyper stack like buffs like defense and offense. I thought it had a limit or
yeah.
something because I don't remember it being explained anywhere from like anyone that I talked to. So I didn't really know until my chat told me,
accumulates.
"Oh, you can like stack offense." Like I was in the battle with Chaos, and I thought you could still only stack offense and defense like twice, like Protect Era and the other one. So that fight took me a lot longer than it should have. But then again, going back into the replayability, I think that that's just like something where you learn next time. Oh, I can like stack all of this magic and destroy everything. That's so cool. So it has its like drawbacks and its positives as well. Especially like at the time it released, not only would you have the player's guide that might explain that, I don't really know. But also you kind of have that schoolyard mentality of talking to other people that have experienced the game differently than you. That kind of goes into like you have a friend over. It's like, oh, you can do this, you can do that. So I think that's kind of like the same thing as like a Twitch chat telling me that I can do that eventually. I just wish that the game would have as well, I guess, like at some point. So I found.
That's the.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. It's just that I think that's the drawback of like more open world games. I think open world in general today is kind of back in full force. A lot of people love these games because like, oh yeah, I want to discover everything on my own. I don't want the game to like handhold me through all of its mechanics. And a lot of that comes from those early days of the NES. Like indeed, what you said, Juice, is perfectly spot on. Like those were the days when the games were designed to be like more of like social like social experiences.
Yeah.
Like they really they had in mind that you were going to talk to friends, etc., to exchange experiences. Like, oh hey, I experimented with this. Like I think that's the perfect word actually. Experimentation. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that really rewarded you back then with all those older games. And now a lot of newer ones today, like Elden Ring, Breath of the Wild, those are games that are kind of bringing back that NES
Yeah.
philosophy that a lot of people were missing. And that's something that you said right now about the stacking magic. That's exactly it. Like that's something interesting that they've done that you really would only find out if you're like, what if I do this? Yeah,
Yeah.
like that's
Yeah.
just
And
one thing that I was curious, Juice. You
sure.
were talking about your experience with balancing, etc. Were you exploring after you got the boat and you could get out of that first continent that kept you locked in before you opened the peninsula? Did you explore exactly the way that the NPCs told you, like, oh, go here, or did you freely explore and you found like, oh, there's this island here, let me see how it is, etc.? Like, did you sequence break or not?
No sequence breaking, I don't think, or maybe I had talked to an NPC and I believe that it told me to go, and it wasn't right after the boat. It was like after the Elven village, I think, or something. And I talked to an NPC that said to go east, but the concept of going like east and west in like the the early Final Fantasies on the map is like, it's weird because I'm looking at the map, right, that's on the screen. So I go east, which takes, and for them, it's like, oh, you should go west because technically it'll take less time to go west and then like have it like scroll back.
Oh,
You know what I mean? So some of the directions are kind of reversed in that sense, like from what there's some dissonance in what I'm looking at and what they're telling me. But there was one time where an NPC told me to do a specific thing, like go in a certain direction, and I did, and I thought that was where I had to go next. And so I hit like 70 random encounters, like going around the entire world to figure out I actually just had to go to the continent that was to the right of me to go to the Crescent Lake, I believe.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So that was like the one point where I was like, okay, that's a little frustrating, but whatever, I guess. Yeah. One thing I will say though about the exploration again, and I know we already talked about this, but I have to bring it back because I thought it was really cool. Is speaking of the Crescent Lake, after I did that, and I got to the point where I was actually hitting random encounters that I felt good about, like when I went into the canoe, and like all those enemies are higher level, so I actually felt like I was getting something out of the random encounters. I sat there and grinded for a while, and it felt very therapeutic and nice to just like level up.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah, but then after that, they had told me to go to a volcano, and I went the wrong way. I actually went to the ice cavern first.
Oh, yeah.
But
yeah.
then the game rewarded me for doing that, because it gives me armor and weapons that are super effective against fire.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I found
Those are
that
cool.
to be really cool in the exploration, even though I didn't do exactly what the game intended me to do. It rewarded me for doing what I did. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, for an NES game, that's pretty cool, right?
Yeah. And like
Yeah, I
the
think
fire
that's-
cavern or the volcano, the Gulag volcano or whatever, would give you stuff to be super effective against ice. But at the point where you are, it's a lot. I think it makes more, or it's like a lot more useful to have the stuff that's super effective against fire, because there's not many like strong enemies in the ice cavern anyway. Even the boss there, which is that eye thing, which is like a joke essentially. It just gets taken out in 2 hits. So. But yeah, going back to where we were saying about balancing and everything like that, I guess you guys can, whoever wanted to talk about it can go ahead. I know I've been talking for a while.
No problem, man. But listening to your experience is refreshing. Like, especially coming, like I have more experience with the NES, so the fact that you're coming fresh from the Pixel Remaster is something I want to listen more. So feel free, man. You can talk all you want.
But yeah, I mean, other than that, I like I said, I found the balancing to be like a little stilted about halfway, even though I was enjoying the game a lot more about halfway through it, about like when I got to the second fiend and I kind of understood the language of the game and the NPCs to tell me exactly where to go. The game became a lot more enjoyable at that point because I wasn't traveling the entire world and hitting 30,000 random encounters. But because of that, like the balancing, like we were saying, like most of the bosses were kind of like really, really easy for me until Warmech and Chaos, which even like Chaos was still like, it was more of like a time sink than it was difficult, you know what I mean? Because I had Phoenix Downs, I had plenty of magic charges, et cetera, at that point. So I'm curious as to how that differs from the other versions. Like you said, it would be a lot harder going into it, like the final dungeon and like in bosses in general. Yeah, so
yeah, chaos is a monstrosity in there just because it's like you have nothing left at that point.
Yeah,
Right.
Your blood dry, you know. So yeah, it's different. Like I said, how do you preserve that in a modern experience? I don't really know. Like I don't know how I might have done it better myself to like preserve that insane experience, and I don't think it would have been like not putting in ethers or something. So I think it's okay. Like, you know, it's such an old game at this point. You don't need people to suffer like how we did back then. You know?
Yeah.
I would actually do something different. I would instead of adding ethers, I would change the amount of magic charges per level. I think that making them
That's a
more
good idea.
abundant, I think that would still keep the spirit of the original. Like because I think that the main thing about the magic system, the appeal of it, is that if you have magic charges, you're going to be a lot more conservative with how you use your magic strategically. So that's very different when you have like ethers to constantly replenish your charges, etc. In the original, you couldn't. So like the fact that you have this limitation imposes creativity on the player and like to strategize more, like, okay, maybe I should save this magic here for stronger enemies. Like especially when you're having so many encounters, you start to really know which like the enemies by heart. Like you have basically the bestiary in your head. So like
it also made like magic feel very special.
Yes.
Speaking of like imagination, like when you cast a spell, it's like a big deal. It's like I'm gonna use lightning, like you said, I hope it hits. You know, like I hope it's like it felt really special. It's not just like, yeah, whatever. We got like 900. We can use ethers. It changes the experience, definitely.
Oh yeah, that's the other thing about the original battle system as well, is if two people were targeted against an enemy and one of them hit and killed it, then the other one would not auto aim onto the next one. So that must have been mighty inconvenient. Like on the other side of what you're saying, I would find it like because I like the idea of that magic system again, like you were saying, but I guess it depends how abundant those magic charges are. Because if you don't know where you're going, and you get into random encounters with like 9 enemies, and you just want to use, you know, Thundara and take them all out at once, but you're wasting that magic charge and you don't have the ethers to replenish it, that means you have to go all the way back to an inn and hit a bunch of random encounters on the way back too. Exactly. So it's like
so
it's so hard.
And there's ways like
I'm sorry, go ahead, Philip.
No, I was just gonna say quickly, there's ways like I think it's FF3 Pixel Remaster did it great. There's a ton of magic charges. Like that's a great example of how you can like find a balance. That's all I was gonna say.
I was gonna say I like the magic charges too because I really like resource management in games. That's kind of what it felt like to me. Especially, you know, I love Resident Evil games, and those games are full to the brim of resource management,
organization.
Just like it felt like a precious resource. You know, I like that aspect you tried to talk about with the original game. Because in this one, you just get ethers and you're like, oh well, more magic.
Yeah, totally.
I think that the balancing thing that I started, the more I played, the more I noticed that there is like this there is this optimal way of using your money and exploring the world. So like there are points where you start to get a lot of equipment that aren't necessarily useful to you. You get a lot of those, and it's kind of like the game is giving you options for you to sell to get more gil because it expects you to max your potion count. So you keep getting all the potions and cabins, etc. So you strategically use cabins when needed, when you're like, oh, okay, like maybe I got lost in the world here, so I'm going to max here the potion, so when I get back on land, I'm going to use a cabin or etc. Like there is this gameplay cycle that is very unorthodox, I would say. Like there weren't many RPGs that had like this reliance on like, oh yeah, usually when you get a weapon, it's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna get super upgraded, I'm gonna get buffed. But no, there were actually a lot of a lot of weapons that were completely useless in respect to like getting stronger. But this was more like the devs giving you options to get a lot more money. Like there are certain tiers where like in the early game you're like at like a couple of thousand gil at best, but then like when you get to like the Crescent Lake or go like to the second continent like near Lufenia, like you're around like now I have like 20,000 gil, 30,000 gil. And this economy change, like you start to really, it's easier to buy potions and start to really manage your items in the overworld like this, because I think that's the way that they thought about it. But if you're not aware of how to manage like these equipments that you get and how much you need to buy these items, you're going to struggle a lot in that regard. I think the game has a particular balance that doesn't tell you that this is the way that the gameplay cycle should work. You just need to learn on your own, like through experimentation, basically. So what your experience, Juice, like it's something that I've heard before as well, like even with people who play the original. So it's not unheard of. Like I understand you, I really do.
And it's not even, it's like I did not use a tent, a cabin, or anything because of the fact that the game gave me all those ethers. And I completely forgot that it was an even option until you told me. Even though I bought like 20 of each.
Yeah, that says it all, yeah.
I forgot
that was,
it because...
an integral part.
Yeah, that must have been, because you wouldn't want to go all the way back to an inn just to recover your yeah,
No.
Of course not. So it's like, but like the game, and what you were saying about getting all that equipment that you could sell later, specifically if you're going out of your way to explore everything in the dungeons, like
That's true.
yeah,
That's true.
so but it's important because you like you're taught from the start of the game that, like, especially in the original, when things are more expensive, is that like you have to like grind for some gil and kind of reserve that and be very smart about it. Not to mention the story has points where it requires you to spend like, I think it's 50,000 gil for a specific item to move on as well. So maybe you don't have the gil, but you've explored, so you can then sell that equipment that it's at that point useless to you to move on from there. By the way, speaking of that, I could not find that shop, that one that's in the desert. I could not find it for the longest time. I completely forgot until just now, but I was like, oh my goodness, where is it? I don't know if it looks different on NES or some of the other ports.
No, it doesn't. It's a random tile. Like you just have to walk on it, and by miracle, I found it. Yeah,
okay.
No, that's yeah, that was a trashy thing. Yeah,
I was like looking at a guide because I was like, where is this? And they just showed, it's on a tile on a desert next to a tree or something, which is essentially something similar to what an NPC said. And I was like, okay, why am I even looking at this guide then?
Yeah.
But I eventually, I eventually found it. I was like, oh, thank goodness, I can finally move on. I also like that the game allows you to like, or certain like NPCs and stuff were talking to you about like what items you would need to get into the Mirage Tower or whatever that thing is in the desert. That was always cool. I liked that about the game. But yeah, I don't want to get stuck on this for too much longer. Let's head right into story. I know Hylian, you had some things to say about this, so why don't you start? Like, well, how does the game tell its story?
Okay, so one of the reasons why I love Final Fantasy 1 is like it's unorthodox today in the sense that usually stories, modern stories, we value a lot of character, but the main party in Final Fantasy 1, we don't actually know their backgrounds. We don't know. They don't really have like a particular personality, but I think there is a purpose to this. I think they did this specifically because the main appeal of Final Fantasy 1 was everything else. It was the world building and how the characters, the NPCs, told the history of their village and how they interacted with others and the villains that existed with the fiends and the lore was the major thing that really made Final Fantasy 1 story interesting. And I think I even say this in A Living Legacy. They might still be blank slates, but there is a very cool detail that Final Fantasy 1 did with the main party as an RPG. Before that, even in Dragon Quest, when you're playing in specific battles, you're always in first person. because the intent of the RPGs is that you put yourself in the hero's shoes, so that's why there are blank slates in that regard. Like you are building your own party, you are building your own characters, and you are in the adventure. But Final Fantasy 1, while they still refrain from telling much about the backgrounds of these characters, and they are still very much open for players to put themselves in their shoes, they are now established as entities of their own. You see battles in third person. Like, that's a detail that wasn't really seen in RPGs often back then. It was always first person. So the fact that there is this attention to detail, like that, listen, these are entities that they have their own autonomy. You are playing as them. You might identify as them, but they are entities that exist in this world. Like, it's limited, but there is an attention to character that was kind of revolutionary at the time. It seems kind of small, but it was a big step.
That's an
in the
interesting
narrative
point.
direction.
Yeah.
And but in terms of like the lore, etc., like you find a ton. Actually, Final Fantasy 1 is a fantastic example of like how can you take another work, its world, its characters, and still make an original work out of it. Because the more you look into Dungeons and Dragons, the more you realize like what the frick, like Sakaguchi and company just took a ton of entities from this work here and completely brought all over Final Fantasy 1. So like Bahamut is from there. Like the four fiends, they all have the same names. Like they're the enemies in the game. Like the evil eye actually had a different name in Japanese that was identical to the same creature in Dungeons and Dragons. They had to change a lot of names
It had a different
West
sprite
to
as
avoid
well.
copyright issues.
It had a different sprite too. They weren't even.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So like but the reason why Final Fantasy 1 got its own identity, etc., was its execution and how they got these Western entities and made its own world. Like Garland, like he was his own thing. Like Chaos, he was his own thing. Like the cities, etc. The way that they interacted was unique. So one thing that I really, really love about Final Fantasy 1 was the story behind like how there were these different temples, how these forces of nature, like they keep the world in balance. So like you have this very Japanese religious background to it, like the Shintoist, you would call it, the Shintoist background, where you value the balance of nature as the good side of the story. The forces in they call it forces in the story, right? So the fiends are basically the forces of nature being used for evil. They are essentially the crystals of water, fire, wind, etc., being twisted and created entities of evil, etc., by creating imbalance. So you would see this perpetuate in other works as well. So like there are a lot of story details in Final Fantasy 1 that are extremely interesting when you look even on a cultural and religious background. They impart a lot of religious subtext, etc. And one final thing, I know I'm speaking too much, I'm sorry, but one thing that I really loved about Final Fantasy 1 was the floating castle. Jesus Christ, like the Lufenians are probably the most awesome part of the world building, because they provide this idea of like how is Final Fantasy 1 a post-apocalyptic world or not? Because the Lufenians are essentially just futuristic people. Like they call it the floating castle. I posted recently like the art that Yoshitaka Amano made for the floating castle, and it looks like the floating an actual castle, like as in like Miyazaki's Castle in the Sky, Laputa. But but when you play the game, the original, and that's something you don't see in the other versions, and that's one of my criticisms for every version after the NES, is that they removed every single reference that the floating castle was actually a satellite. It was a space station. It wasn't some like fantasy inspired castle like you see in Miyazaki films. It was actually like you could even see sprites of like chairs, like the one that you're sitting right now, Juice, or you, Philip. Like they had those exact chairs in tables. Like you could see PC servers, etc. And the way that the second floor was laid out, like you could see that they looped around because it was actually a circle. Like it was, you could even see the stars in the background. but in the Pixel remaster, they're actually in the sky. So there was this attention to detail that it was like this futuristic civilization that actually reached the stars was kind of lost, and I think that's an unfortunate side effect of it. But when you see the surviving Lufenians that are on Earth and they are all wearing these Greek robes, etc., like that's such an awesome, unique part that Dungeons and Dragons doesn't really have in this way. So that's one of the probably the biggest thing that I love about Final Fantasy I's world building. So yeah, now I'm done. I swear I finished my my.
Yeah, that's a very
my
interesting point because I didn't get that at all from like when I reached that point in the game. So that's cool. I like
yeah,
that.
like the way I think that the most interesting thing about all of this world building is that they really try to make you understand that they describe things that they don't understand in this world under medieval terms. So like when they see like this shining thing in the sky, they say something along the lines of like some magic thing, but that fell near the waterfall, but it's actually a transporting cube that is super futuristic that they don't understand. The floating castle wasn't actually a castle, but that's the best way that they can describe what a space station would look like.
Right.
So that's awesome.
Yeah, totally. And that's why people
love it.
like you'll hear a lot of people kind of like miscategorize Final Fantasy. They'll be like, "Oh man, I can't believe like, you know, Final Fantasy's always been medieval only."
Oh,
and
no,
everything.
no,
I can't
no.
believe like FF7. I'm so tired of it. It's like, dude, FF1 has like a Gundam war mech in it.
Yeah, the war mech. Exactly.
You go into space in FF1. Like I always say.
Yeah.
People.
I found that
the enemy. Oh, I'm sorry. You
Oh,
can go on, Juice.
I was just gonna say when I reached the point where I was talking to a robot that gave me a transporting cube, I was like, "What? This is different."
The mix of cool concepts like that. It's not just like one thing.
And time travel,
like the biggest
time travel
mysteries.
too.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
I think that, like even the war mech that you guys mentioned, like one of the enemies, like one of the, I think it's called the sweeper in Final Fantasy VII.
That's exactly what I thought of when I saw that.
It's war mech.
War mech.
Yeah.
Like
I was like, hey, it's a sweeper.
Yeah,
exactly.
You gotta love it. It's just there's so many cool concepts that they play with that echo through
Final
the
Fantasy
series.
VII. I'm gonna eventually get to this in the Living Legacy, but there are actually a ton. Like some people say, oh, Final Fantasy VII is so different from 1 through 6, and I couldn't disagree more. Like Final Fantasy VII is so extremely pro original. Like there are even the way. So I'm gonna just throw out a curiosity here that I'm going to talk about this in the future in my channel, but. Even the materia, like each game has their own interpretation of what crystals are, right?
Yeah, it's a crystal.
And one of the things that also future versions of Final Fantasy 1 changed that only stayed in the NES. In the NES, crystals were actually orbs. The materia in Final Fantasy 7 was exactly a reference to Final Fantasy 1 crystals. Every single crystal, like in every port of Final Fantasy 1 after the NES, they were modeled after the crystals from Final Fantasy 3, Final Fantasy 4, etc. And that's a part that it's not a big issue, okay? It's not anything major, but it's one of the things that I always loved about the original version of Final Fantasy 1. They're like, oh, they made this bridge in Final Fantasy 7 with the crystals. Materia is basically the original crystals from Final Fantasy 1. That's why they had all these elements that are infused in the crystals, and so the ancients in 7 are kind of like using the knowledge that the folks in Final Fantasy 1 had with the crystals. So it's awesome, man. I'm sorry, I know I'm gushing out on this, but man, I love this game.
That's really interesting.
Yeah,
it's awesome.
I didn't think about that. And also, like, this game has one of the biggest unsolved mysteries of our life. How did Link die?
Actually,
Like,
wait,
why?
wasn't it Erdrick? Wasn't it Erdrick at a point? Okay, it was Erdrick, and then it changed to Link.
Original, in the original,
Good
it was
change.
Erdrick.
Good change. No, that's the best change.
The shade throne. It's beautiful.
That's
Gotta
so
love
funny.
that. But no, I think just my piece on the story talk is just again back to imagination. You know, I mentioned it briefly, but like Garland, it's a perfect thing. Like when we were kids, it's just like, whoa, who is this guy? And because you know there's a little bit of a skeleton of a story, it's like, wait, he was a knight who kind of like fell from his grace, so to speak. And I was like, what happened? What kind of guy was he? You know, why did he kidnap the princess? And it's just really cool. And you know, we'll get games like Stranger of Paradise and stuff, having fun with this. but it's just, especially back in that era, there wasn't so much like that in video games. Again, I talk about Mega Man. It's just like you're fighting robots, cool. Like there's no like deeper story than that. So yeah, it was really great as far as the imagination goes. And then even stuff like Bahamut, the Dragon King, like bring your characters to these next levels, evolution was so cool, especially for replay value too. Because then you're like, whoa, what if I had picked a thief instead of a warrior? Like you wonder what that was. So it just felt very different for storytelling back then, and it almost feels more like a stage play or theater because of the top-down view, which I always talk about with FF6, which is why they're very smart to like make it pretty much an opera, right? But I love how they approached it, and it's just a classic example of using the limitations, the strength of the limitations, so to speak, using the hardware to its strength, as opposed to saying like, oh, I can't do such and such.
Yep.
Is doing the best you can. Yeah, being really creative with it. Like limitation often inspires great.
There's
creativity.
A lot of games that do that. Why I love those kind of games.
Yeah, exactly. And like again, the music is a whole other thing, which we could talk about a whole podcast in itself. But I mean, yeah, that's I think is the biggest storytelling mechanism of FF1 is the music.
Yeah, we could totally
so
do a podcast about music in Final Fantasy. That would go ham. I mean, I know I'm a musician. I think you are. I know you are as well, Philip. So that would be interesting.
Love it. Absolutely love it. Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day. We've been, like I just said, we're going through the Pixel Remaster of 6. Just every song that comes on, we're like, analyzing it and losing our minds. It's just so cool. But yeah, Nobuo is the ultimate, I would say. Like with Koji Kondo, who I'm sure you guys know from Zelda,
of course,
is like just those two for me are the ultimate. Like using the technology to its absolute limit and being creative to create these amazing sounds, memorable sounds. Because I mean, in FF1 especially, you're looking at like sometimes 15-second, 30-second loops of these songs.
Yeah,
maybe 45 seconds. And the fact that like the battle theme from FF1 on the NES is so engaging and so interesting. You listen to it for like 50 hours. It's so good. And something I talk about a lot with all the Pixel remasters is that it's been so cool because as a kid, especially with the NES like sound font, you have no idea what instrument it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
Right? Like is that a strings? Is that a trumpet? Is that an electric guitar? You have no idea. So
It's
there's this
square
kind of
wave.
intersection of like, yeah, it's like everybody has their imagination of what this song sounds like, and then Nobuo did too when he wrote it.
Yep.
Right. So then now we have finally the Pixel Remaster, because if you didn't know, he came back to do this. He came back like John Wick, and he's like, "We're doing this," and he told them like what instrument was each, and we have this beautiful intersection. Like that's what it was supposed to sound like. So it's just been such a pleasure taking in all these songs, and I think it's just another way they like preserved the integrity of these, because I think that's really what these are at its core is for us who grew up with it, letting us come back to it, and for new people to be like, what started this franchise? Like this is the most faithful sort of preservation of it. And they may go on to do like 2D or 3D 2D, whatever they call that, like Octopath style versions of these, which would be fun. But I'm glad they also did these to kind of like lock it in.
And before we go hard on music, the question that I wanted to present was, how did the themes of this game influence the future direction of the series? Like, how do we see the classic Four Fiends quests or the elementals come into play in something like, God, I don't know, I haven't even played it, Final Fantasy 15. Does anyone have any thoughts on that?
I sure it goes through completely, like a narrative thread goes through completely of just like, what is the basis of FF1? Like these 4 heroes come to this world who aren't really heroes yet, right? They're starting out their journey. They have like rags on and they don't even have weapons, right? They have to fully equip them. And by the end, they get powered up by Bahamut. They, essentially like exchange powers with the gods and do all these great things and then save the world and become these heroes. And like it was said, it's inferred that it's a self-insert character. At these like kind of like Chrono Trigger style, like silent protagonists, But as you get further into the series, we have performances now. We have mocap, we have voice acting, we have all these great tools. Let's make these characters more like you would see in a film or a novel. So I love that they kind of keep the spirit of that. And then Bahamut is still in every single game, right? And then that's why I always mention FF3. Like you have all Ifrit and Shiva and all these awesome characters who appear throughout all the games. And it always feels like the spirit of that is kept for me throughout all the games. So I think it's very much there, even though each game reinvents itself. It's kind of this like iconography of music of kind of fun imagery like chocobos and moogles, besides the musical themes, magic spells and summons and everything. It's all there, but it's kind of like a fun artistic exercise each time. That's why it's fun with even like 16. It's more of a slightly different team. You have the director from The Last Remnant tackling 16, along with being produced by Yoshida from 14. That's a really cool combo, right? But it still is going to be Final Fantasy, which is this kind of like vague cloud of these ideas, So I think it's great, and I think it's been there 1 through 16.
How about you, Hylian?
Well, I think that I would say that Final Fantasy 1 established kind of let's say more central things of like how should I put this? Unlikely heroes that come together to grow and fight a major oppressive force that brings unbalance to the world in some form or another. There are, of course, other major things. Like I mentioned briefly, like the Shintoist background. I think that actually really, it really kept going throughout many Final Fantasy games. Like the importance of balance of nature, like from the very beginning of the game, like what actually drives our heroes and everyone to understand that the world is in darkness. The world isn't actually taken over by Garland. Chaos isn't actually alive yet. What the world understands as darkness is actually like nature is falling out of balance. Like the wind is dying, the earth is rotting, the sea is violent, etc. Like. So basically, these concepts would be brought over to like Final Fantasy 2, Final Fantasy 3, up to like 9 and 10. I would say you can even find similar ideas in games afterwards. But I would say that stuff like narrative tropes of unlikely heroes, of fighting a major oppressive force that comes from the Star Wars influence that Sakaguchi had from the very beginning, like from the rebels with the Empire. You have this dichotomy persist from like Final Fantasy VI with the Returners and the Gestalt Empire, and Final Fantasy VII with Avalanche and Shinra. These concepts are kind of set up from the very beginning. There is also there are many tropes that we kind of understand, like summons and chocobos, etc., that would come later. But I think that Final Fantasy 1 bringing a lot of like religious icons like Shiva and Ifrit and other entities from mythology is something that is also ingrained in the lore of numerous Final Fantasy games. A lot of people try to understand like what actually binds these games together, right? Because they are very different worlds, very different stories, etc. But one of the things that you could say is Final Fantasy 1's love for bringing these religious and mythological ideas, these classical storytelling tropes, and creating a new story with similar precepts. And of course, presentation, I would say, is another big thing, like Kazuko Shibuya's philosophy of making these sprite works. The fact that these characters are supposed to be deformed to provide this larger scope of like understanding like how they feel, what they are. Even in Final Fantasy 1, you can see them nodding, actually. Like you can see certain situations, like when the Warrior of Light learns how to speak Luthanian, for example. Like the guy actually teaches him, exactly. Like these are subtle movements because of the limitations of the time. You couldn't really have a very complex dialogue, etc. But you could use a lot of body language. And I think that Final Fantasy 1's minimalist storytelling is something that had also influenced a ton Final Fantasy up to Final Fantasy 9, when they still didn't have voice acting, but they relied a lot on their limitations to tell a much richer story with open-ended parts where fans still talk to this day like, how did this character think? Like, this body language tells that, etc. Like, there is a lot of subtlety that brings a lot of longevity, I would say. to these works. So I would say that Final Fantasy 1 brought these things and more, of course, like design ideas, etc. But I'm kind of getting a bit too long here in this aspect. So
No,
go ahead,
it's-
Andy.
shortly.
Oh, okay. And what I was going to say is that like we're almost getting into what the spirit of Final Fantasy is, like in
Yeah.
general, which I feel like we've already kind of touched on. But I also just thinking about like the time travel and stuff like that is really funny to me how people say that Final Fantasy VII Remake and Nomura get all their time travel shenanigans from Kingdom Hearts and stuff, and it's just so
Right, I
silly
always
to
say
me,
that, yeah.
especially like when I go back.
It's just like telling
Final
me you're
Fantasy
not a
1.
FF fan without telling
Yeah.
you're
So,
not an FF fan, right?
I would say
FF1.
I would admit that I'm one of the people that I'm not a fan at all of this storytelling decision for 7 Remake, and actually one of the things that I
Which is not
wanted
confirmed
to
yet,
say,
by the way.
Yeah, it's
no,
not
yeah. In
yeah.
fact, I don't think it's necessarily time travel. It's actually dimension travel. But
That's I would agree.
One
but-
day, one day we'll talk about this in further length. But one thing that I would say is that actually the way that time travel is handled in Final Fantasy 1 is probably its biggest weakness in story, because in fact, I think we didn't have much time to talk about this, but I think that the story was excellent and very, like, you can see when you talk to these NPCs in the linear order that they tell you to, oh, go to the city, etc. If you follow that order, things really make sense. Everything fits together very well until you reach the Chaos Shrine, where you realize, oh, Garland's alive. Like, what the heck? Like, how we saw him die? Like, we killed him. Like, how did the fiends actually
yeah,
send him
it's
back
so
in time? Like,
yeah, I agree.
random. Yeah, it's asshole. I'm sorry if is this PG-13?
You say whatever you want.
Like, it really felt like it was a very last minute decision, and I have a feeling that Sakaguchi did this mainly because they were pushing a deadline. They really needed to get this game out. They had like a goal of releasing within that fiscal year 1987, and they had to get out like at least 500,000 units to actually survive as a company. So
Yeah.
they really did. I think that Sakaguchi really didn't have enough time to flesh out like the conclusion. It really felt like it, because again, they say that he was brought back from death, that the fiends sent him back in time. But even in the NES original, like, if that actually happened, if that was planned from the very beginning, we would see like some sort of effect, like, oh wow, like Garland is flashing and he disappeared or something like that. But no,
Yeah.
we see him actually disintegrate, etc. We see him die. But
Yeah.
at in the very end, we don't see any specific, like, we don't have Garland actually being developed. We don't see any tie to the fiends and how this loop works. In fact, the very end of the game actually leaves kind of open-ended, as in, did the time loop actually break as we know it? Because the only way that the prophecy can exist in their timeline is if the 4 Warriors of Light actually brought something for their reality to exist, to actually have this legend to begin with. And they say that Garland is actually waiting for them when they go back.
Yeah, exactly.
Because Garland could still be fallen, he could still do the same things, and the fiends could still exist, because the only reason the fiends exist is because nature has been brought out of balance. So the idea of the loop is kind of interesting, but the idea of how Garland went back in time and his motivation of creating a time loop is kind of nonsensical.
Yeah, it feels like
The main issue is, like, you bring up some fantastic points, but the main issue is, like, what you just said is like more combined text and dialogue than the entire game could fit. So, like, that's part of the main issue. So there's no space, there's no time, and like, even if they had tried to flesh it out, I don't know how they really could have explained it, like, deep motivate. Like, the dialogue is so terse in the game.
Yeah.
Like, even the deeper explored stuff is just like, this happened, go here, this is happening. So I think it's just the limitation of the hardware, you know.
And
Well,
exactly, like, they had space for only 1 text box per character, so they
Yeah.
didn't have much space at all. You're right about that, but this is precisely why I think that they should have done something different, like a different villain, like maybe just chaos existing itself. Like, instead of bringing Garland back, just make chaos the main villain. Like, chaos, the fact that there is a thing as Chaos Shrine that is in ruins in present day This would have been already a world building hint that chaos actually existed 2,000 years ago, and you would have eventually fight him. Not, you didn't necessarily need to bring Garland into the mix. And the fact that Garland thinks that he's going to be immortal if he makes this loop, like he is eventually going to die a few years after after he went back in time, you know? Like he is just being sent back in time, like in the loop, but he is not necessarily immortal because of this.
In the Pixel Remaster, they say just before he dies, they warp him back in time. So I don't know if that differs from the NES original, but I also wanted to say that I feel like if we're going to say that we need a guidebook for explaining certain things, like a map and maybe some like background on world building and stuff like that, I think that it also makes sense that if they wanted to flesh that out, they could have done it in that book.
Yeah, that's true. But one of the things that made Final Fantasy 1 special is that Final Fantasy 1 was the one game at the time that actually developed its entire narrative on screen. The manual for Final Fantasy 1 was one of the very few games that didn't have any story in it. It was just a map.
For sure.
Like,
and I'm just saying, like, if they wanted to, I guess they could have done that. I mean, like I said, I don't know how the text differs between the NES and the Pixel Remasters and the other ports. I know there have been multiple translation changes since then.
Yes.
So, you know, there's that.
We had the strategy guide later in life, and I don't even remember in the strategy guide it going into any sort of detail on that particularly. So I don't think it and that's like a canon source, you know. So I don't.
Yeah, but I guess like my main point wasn't that like it's a good or bad storytelling device. I just wanted to add that it's like not so crazy for something like that to happen in 7 Remake. Like it's been happening since the original
and it's
Final
in fact
Fantasy.
Very for a villain to do is very on point.
Yeah. So that was my point on that. I guess, do you guys want to go in real quick? I have to go to the bathroom real quick. I'll be right back. But I want to get into some music and artwork and stuff.
Too, if you guys want to take a
we'll take a.
All right.
I just wanted to say that I actually have to go for now. I have some things I need to do. This went a little longer than I was hoping it would, but so I probably won't be around for the rest of it, unfortunately. But it's been a pleasure.
All right, ST, thank you so much for coming, man. It was an awesome time talking to you.
Okay, thank you for having me.
All right, cool.
Should I leave or just stay so it doesn't mess up the layout?
You can just throw off your camera. That way it doesn't mess up the Okay, so we're going to go for a quick break, go to the bathroom, grab water or whatever else you need, and we'll be right back to talk about the rest of the stuff and close out.
All right, let's do it.
Okay.
Yeah, we shouldn't have too much more. I mean, I already said a lot about music too, so I think we're doing pretty good, right?
I actually just got a call saying that my dog is ready to pick up from the groomers too when they close fairly soon, so I'm gonna have to hurry up. But
let's run through it quick.
Yeah, so I guess I don't know if Hylian is back yet or not. I'm guessing not, but we can start anyway, and I'm sure he'll be back shortly. So going through real quick, talking about like the differences between pixel art. The Pixel Remaster does go a lot closer to the NES original than the PSP and GBA, which take a lot of inspiration from the SNES, and I'm not sure which one I prefer more. Going back to the thing we kept saying about how the Pixel Remaster does try its best to preserve the original experience, I find it awesome that you have the choice between the different art styles that you would like. If you want to go back to the SNES art style, then you can play it on the PSP or GBA. But if you want that original NES experience, you can play the Pixel Remaster as well.
Yeah, I agree.
So going into music, I just think it's incredible. Like, we were already talking about how Nobuo Uematsu is a legend and how he can fit so much in so little time with only using 4 instrument tracks on the original NES. Square wave, a triangle wave, and, like, noise. So...
Yeah, it's insane. I see guitars behind you too, so I'm sure you appreciate a lot of the stuff he achieved, especially in the Pixel Remaster.
Going in, like, and you know his style, like you, I went into a town theme. I went into a town, and like as soon as I heard that, I was like, its progression go da 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 da. It's like, oh, this reminds me a lot of like Tifa's theme, or a lot of like
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
other like themes that are supposed to be a lot more relaxing and give you that feeling. He has like a lot of signature. I can't even necessarily say like leitmotifs, because it doesn't refer to like anything that else that happens in the story in something like between comparing those two things, but you just clearly see his style when it comes to like
such
melodies.
a recognizable, such a recognizable style. Like you just said, like the town themes from 1 through 6, even 7, like are so similar, but just in this like, and they get bigger and deeper as he goes. Like he's developing more skills, but also has more instruments and more space and more time. I mean, even FF7, you know.
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting history behind like how Uematsu was actually brought into the project. Like Uematsu wasn't even like he by accident, like he just applied for the job at Square. Like he wasn't recognized yet as a major musician at the time, and because the company was small, was extremely small at the time, he didn't even need to go through like any particular human resource process that a lot of companies have today. Nobuo Uematsu even joked about this, that if he applied today to go to Square, like he would probably not even get a job. But at the time, like he basically met Hironobu Sakaguchi, and they talked a lot with each other, and Uematsu, I think, even gave a sample of his work, and he was like, "Oh my god, that's exactly what I want to hear." So you got the job, etc. And you guys were talking about his style. I'll be honest, Nobuo Uematsu is, of course, I would say he's my favorite composer in the series. Like I like him more than Masashi Hamauzu. I also love him, but no, Uematsu is just amazing to me. And I think one of the reasons for this is his, like, Hamauzu also has a classical background, but I think that Uematsu's understanding of classical music and how he blends it with more contemporary beats is what makes his music special. Like you can hear sometimes the Deep Purple influence in some of his music. Like he's a rock fan as well, so
that's where a lot of it comes from. When you were saying that, I wanted to bring it up, is that like he took a lot of his like his rhythms and melodies that you would hear in something like in the rock of his time, and brings it into mixing with his classical backgrounds to make what we have now. So it's really nice to see.
Yeah, and that's something that you can see from the very first Final Fantasy. So that's something that you could bridge to the previous topic that we were talking about. I think that this identity, this musical identity, is something that was also a founding principle for the rest of the series up until Final Fantasy X, or
it's
after
beautiful,
he left.
Like, we were talking about like he has a distinct style. Like, and I've done this because I'm such a music nerd for this type of stuff. Is like I've made playlists of like every town theme that Nobuo's done from like every game and stuff. And like in 7, you would choose the it's called On Our Way, or the calm theme. You know,
I love On Our Way.
It's like the equivalent mood, you know, and the same style. And then you have like his kind of like softer female character theme, like kind of the Tifa and the Elena and everything. And they're so similar, and they have the similar style. And then you have like exactly. And then you have like kind of the love theme, which is the, you know, Eyes on Me, the theme of love from FF4 being the first. And then you have the town theme from FF5 is oddly enough like one of those sort of love themes. That it's so interesting how it all ties together, and like distinct style differences in each of those.
Even a more melodramatic tone, like Aerith's theme, you can even trace back to part of the Aria de Mezzo Karate, the opera theme from Final Fantasy VI. Like there's actually a leitmotif that is actually carried into Final Fantasy VII's Aerith's theme. So
there's a lot of that.
Yeah,
there's a lot of that. I mean, FF9. I believe it's FF5. There's literally Kuja's theme from FF9.
Oh yeah,
it's
like the same thing.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, it's like one of the dungeon themes. Like the first full like melody that plays is just the same. He's like, yeah, we use this in a random dungeon. This is too good. Let's use it. Like I love seeing stuff like that. And FF3 I would say is kind of the closest we have to like an Aerith type theme. Is what's her name? The Maiden of the Water. Like her song is so like that same mood and stuff. Anyway. it's awesome. We talk about it all day, but there's so many like awesome style, instantly recognizable Nobuo
I think
style.
the battle themes are kind of like a basically the best example of this. Like a
Yeah,
ton of Final Fantasy battle themes, they start with that like
the baseline. Yep.
yeah, the baseline is constant. Like he always changes a little bit. Like even Final Fantasy 7, you have like the initial victory theme, but then it transitions into something new. Like I think that's also something that is very characteristic of Uematsu. Like this this hyper valuing of like the tradition, but also using tradition as a platform to create something new, like kind of
Mhm.
maintaining that identity. Like that's something that I love a lot about Uematsu's work. So I think that's
Yeah, beautiful. And we already, I would go all day, but like I said, I only have like a few more minutes before I have to close out because I just
We
got
already
that
touched on
call.
a lot of the outline. I
Yeah.
was looking through like
Yeah,
we
we,
Yeah.
we
covered.
touched on a lot of this, so I just want to go through and say our final thoughts. Feel
Yeah.
free to shill your stuff. We'll all be in the description in the YouTube description down below. But yeah, so the final thoughts for me is that like I would never force anyone to play Final Fantasy 1, but I think that if you're looking for a classic JRPG experience to understand where a lot of the modern tropes come from, then definitely do yourself a favor and play through the game. And I think the Pixel Remaster is a good port, but the PSP and GBA ports have extra content that are not in the Pixel Remaster or the NES original. So I almost want to say to go with those, like extra bosses and dungeons and stuff like that, which is kind of sad that it didn't transfer over to the Pixel Remaster. But I mean, we could talk all day about how it's trying to preserve the original Final Fantasy one, like we have. But yeah, so overall,
Yeah.
great experience, bar some like inconveniences of it being an old video game where it kind of felt like, yes, I am playing a video game. You know what I mean? But
Yeah.
other than that, as far as my stuff goes, you can follow me over on Twitch at twitch.tv/juice_polydot, YouTube under the same name, or you could join our Discord, which will be in the description below as well. How about you guys throw out your final thoughts and chill, and then we'll say bye-bye.
Yeah, I think I actually don't agree with you on the PSP, and I played it on PS1 too, Final Fantasy Origins.
Oh,
I
okay.
think the main thing being the art style is completely lost in those. Like it's this kind of
Yeah.
cartoony, bright type thing, and like it really lost the spirit of that like dark fantasy Yoshitaka Amano drawing, especially for the monsters and then the characters, like these cartoony things. But the music is the greatest offense there because they didn't have Nobuo come back. You
Oh.
completely lose the spirit of almost every song to the point where some are like, what were they thinking with like with some of the songs? I think are just completely like miss the point and the spirit. Whereas the Pixel Remasters, obviously we have Nobuo and it feels like coming home.
Yeah.
So that's my thoughts on that. And you know, I think the Pixel Remaster is like the definitive experience. And the extra dungeons for 1 through 6, like especially in FF6 and those later ones, are very, very like tacked on, like very kind of I don't think there's a lot of depth to the content because you can tell it's just like, oh, make a stronger thing that they can fight. I don't think it's very meaningful content because it wasn't a lot of it having like the whole team coming back. It was just like, let's for this remaster throw something in. That's just my opinion. But I will say thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure
course.
just to sit down and talk with about our favorite stuff. Right? You can find me on any site. Come by the gaming channel. Come by Twitch and chat. It's been great being on. Thank you.
You got it. Nice having you. And how about you, Hylian?
Well, my final thoughts. I would say that if you're someone who is interested in, just learning about like the history of the medium, like history of RPGs, if you're into like, if you love games, and if you're open-minded and ready to like accept more limited mechanics, etc. And or if you're just a Final Fantasy fan and you want to understand more like where a lot of the tropes, like where all of these things came from, I would highly suggest you play Final Fantasy 1. I think that Final Fantasy 1 is a revolutionary work. It's a master class in like world building. I would say it's one of the seriously a contender for one of the best of its time. I would say it's a game that one of the bigger games that really epitomizes Sakaguchi's design philosophy and storytelling ideas for the most part. And yeah, so overall, it's a fantastic game. I'm looking specifically at the original because that's my main experience. But like it's a fantastic game that could have been a lot better if it had a bit more time and guidance in the programming, so a lot of the mechanics would work better, etc. On a normative level, it would probably have fared better, but it's still a very fun game. If I were to suggest which version to play, depends on what you're looking for. If you want the original experience, if you want to understand what Sakaguchi had in mind with the world building, etc., play the original. If you want a more complete and polished experience, play the Pixel remaster, because you're going to get, as Philip said, the spirit of the music, the visuals, etc. The Pixel remaster does a very good job in remaking the original. So I would say I would probably recommend those two, and the GBA version mainly for the extra dungeons, because they're also a lot of fun. They're an extra challenge for those who like the game. So overall, wonderful. I'm on Discord. I have my own server, and I have my channel on YouTube. If you want to hear me ramble more, like I know I've talked a lot here on the podcast. I'm sorry if I
no,
spoke
it's
too much,
appreciated, man.
But if you enjoyed this and more, if you want to hear more about like the historical context, if you want to hear more about the symbology, like what were in the minds of the creators, etc., and you love Final Fantasy VII, check out my channel. You'll love what I'm doing right now. It's a major project that I'm going to be on for years on the original Final Fantasy VII called The Living Legacy. So hop on there and on my server. And Juice, thank you so much for having me here. It's been an honor to be among you, and talking also with ST and Philip. Philip, I've been also your fan for quite some time. Didn't have time to say this, but I've also seen you before, and I hope I see you around as well in my community as well, because it's awesome to hear you talk about Final Fantasy and meet someone from that generation as well. So it's been wonderful. It's been wonderful talking to all of you.
Yeah, it was definitely really fun and awesome, insightful conversation. I hope to talk to you guys again. If either of you want to come on for 2 through 5 or 6, just let me know. I know 7's gonna be a crazy time as well, but yeah, we'll get there. I'm gonna have to close out now. Thank you guys so much for coming on, and I'll talk to you guys later.
Take care, friends. See ya.
Bye bye.
Take care.